mountain gave them silver for 20 years before it decided to keep something in return. The Smuggler Mine sits on the western shoulder of Smuggler Mountain, less than 2 miles from the center of modern-day Aspen, Colorado. Today, the town is synonymous with wealth, ski chalets, private jets, and restaurants where a single meal costs more than a 19th-century miner earned in a month. But in 1879, when prospectors first broke ground on the silver vein that would define the region's economy, Aspen was nothing more than a cluster of canvas tents and desperate men. The Smuggler became one of the most productive silver mines in American history. By 1890, it employed over 500 workers and had produced ore worth millions of dollars. The mine's tunnels extended more than 2,000 feet into the mountain, dropping through 7 distinct levels connected by a series of shafts, winzes, and crosscuts. The work was dangerous. Cave-ins were common. Silicosis claimed men slowly. But miners came anyway, drawn by wages that exceeded anything they could earn on the surface. The 7th level was the deepest. Opened in 1892, it required workers to descend nearly 1,800 feet below the main entrance, a journey that took over 40 minutes by ore bucket. The air at that depth was thick and warm. Ventilation systems struggled to push fresh oxygen through the labyrinthine passages. Miners who worked the 7th level often described a particular stillness that distinguished it from the levels above. Sound behaved differently down there, they said. Voices didn't carry. Pickaxes struck rock with a muted quality, as if the mountain was absorbing the noise. Foreman William Hennessy kept meticulous shift logs. On the morning of November 12, 1894, he recorded the names of 17 men assigned to extend the 7th level's western drift. The crew included experienced hard rock miners, several recent immigrants from Cornwall and Sweden, and 2 local men who had worked the Smuggler since its earliest days. They descended at 6:15 in the morning. A surface worker named Thomas Birch confirmed their arrival at the 7th level's main station by signal bell at 7:02. That was the last verified contact with any member of the crew. When the men failed to return at the scheduled shift change, Hennessy organized a search party. What they found at the entrance to the western drift has never been adequately explained. 17 carbide lamps sat in a neat row against the tunnel wall, each one still burning. 17 pickaxes leaned beside them, arranged with a uniformity that suggested deliberate placement rather than abandonment. Lunch pails, canteens, and personal effects were organized in small piles, one for each man, but the tunnel itself was sealed, not collapsed. Sealed. The rock face that met the search party appeared solid, unbroken, and undisturbed. There was no rubble, no evidence of a cave-in. The passage simply ended, as if it had never extended any farther. Hennessy's report, filed with the mine's ownership group 3 days later, described the scene in clinical terms. The drift terminates at approximately 40 feet from the main station, he wrote. No evidence of structural failure, no indication of disturbance to surrounding strata. The 17 men assigned to this section have not been located. A mining engineer named Frederick Holbrook was brought in from Denver to assess the situation. His findings, preserved in the Colorado School of Mines archive, remain difficult to reconcile with the known facts. Holbrook's geological survey concluded that the rock sealing the western drift was not recent. Core samples extracted from the formation showed mineral deposits and compression patterns consistent with stone that had been in place for at least 10,000 years. The notion that this material was deposited within the past week, month, or even century is not supported by any physical evidence, Holbrook wrote. The formation predates not only this mine, but likely any human presence in the region. When asked to explain how 17 men could have passed through rock that appeared to have existed since the last ice age, Holbrook offered no theory. His report simply noted the discrepancy and recommended that the 7th level be permanently closed. Local residents who lived through that winter remembered the silence that followed. The mine continued operations on the upper levels, but workers refused assignments below the 5th. A Swedish immigrant named Eric Lindquist, who had been part of the initial search party, gave a statement to a Pitkin County recorder several months later. "The lamps were still burning when we found them," Lindquist said. "All 17, burning clean, like they'd just been lit. But the oil in those lamps, we calculated later, the oil would have run out in 4 hours. We didn't reach that drift until nearly 6 in the evening. They'd been burning for 11 hours on 4 hours of fuel." Lindquist left Aspen in the spring of 1895. He reportedly never worked underground again. A woman named Margaret Connolly, whose husband Patrick was among the 17, provided testimony to a local journalist in 1903. By then, nearly a decade had passed, but Connolly remembered the aftermath with uncomfortable clarity. "They told us there'd been an accident," she said, "but there were no bodies, no funeral. The company paid us 6 months' wages and asked us to sign a paper saying we wouldn't discuss the particulars. Most of us signed. What else could we do? But I never believed it was an accident. An accident leaves something behind." Connolly mentioned one detail that didn't appear in official records. According to her, several wives received letters from their husbands dated November 12th, the day of the disappearance, but postmarked November 15th, 3 days later. The letters contained nothing unusual, brief notes about the weather, questions about children, requests for warmer socks. But the dates were impossible. The men had been missing for 3 days before the letters were sent. The smuggler mine's ownership changed hands twice in the years following the incident. Records from the first transfer, completed in 1897, include a curious provision. The new owners agreed to maintain a permanent concrete seal on the 7th level's western drift and to refrain from any excavation within 200 feet of the site. The reason given was structural instability, though Holbrook's survey had found no evidence of compromised geology. In 1904, the smuggler experienced a massive flood that killed 20 miners on the 6th level, a disaster that remains one of the deadliest in Colorado history. The flood's cause was attributed to the accidental breach of an underground water source, but internal correspondence recovered decades later reveals that company engineers had warned against extending a particular drainage tunnel, citing unpredictable acoustic readings and anomalous air pressure differentials in the area adjacent to the sealed 7th level drift. The warnings were ignored. The drainage tunnel was extended. 2 days later, the flood occurred. A geophysicist from the University of Colorado named Sandra Morales conducted an unauthorized sonar survey of Smuggler Mountain in 1987. Her findings were never formally published, but a summary appeared in a regional geology newsletter the following year. Morales reported the presence of a large void space approximately 1,900 feet below the surface, directly beneath the location of the sealed western drift. The void measured roughly 60 feet in diameter and showed no natural geological explanation for its existence. "The cavity appears artificial," Morales wrote, "but predates any mining activity in the region by several thousand years. I have no explanation for its presence or its relationship to the 1894 incident." Morales requested funding to conduct a more extensive survey. Her request was denied. The following semester, she was reassigned to a teaching position with no research obligations. She retired in 2001 and declined all subsequent interview requests. Today, the Smuggler Mine is closed to the public. The main entrance is gated, and the tunnels below the 3rd level have been flooded for decades. Local hiking trails pass within a few hundred feet of the original workings, and tourists occasionally photograph the weathered head frame that still stands near the summit. Most visitors know nothing about the 7th level. The 17 names do not appear on any memorial. The company records were dispersed across multiple archives after the mine's final closure, and key documents, including Hennessy's original shift log, have been reported missing since at least 1952. But in Aspen's Historical Society, there is a photograph that docents rarely display. It shows the entrance to the Western Drift, taken on the morning of November 13, 1894, approximately 16 hours after the search party's discovery. The image is overexposed and slightly blurred, but the 17 lamps are visible against the tunnel wall. In the photograph, all 17 are still burning. The 7th level of the smuggler mine was never reopened. The concrete seal installed in 1895 remains in place. No bodies were ever recovered. No explanation was ever offered. And somewhere beneath Smuggler Mountain, a void that shouldn't exist, continues to hold whatever it took on the morning of November 12, 1894, along with the 11 hours of lamplight that physics cannot account for. The ledger balanced itself. That was what the company accountant said before he resigned and left Creede forever. Creede, Colorado, sits at the bottom of a narrow canyon carved by Willow Creek, surrounded by volcanic cliffs that rise nearly 1,000 feet on either side. The town exists because of silver. In 1890, a prospector named Nicholas Creede discovered one of the richest ore deposits in American history on the canyon's northern slope, and within 2 years, the population swelled to more than 10,000. Saloons operated 24 hours a day. The railroad extended a spur line directly into the canyon. Bat Masterson dealt cards in a gambling hall on Main Street. For a brief, frenzied moment, Creede was the most valuable piece of ground in Colorado. But the town almost never existed at all. Before Nicholas Creede's discovery, a different group of investors had attempted to establish a mining operation in the same canyon. In 1889, 44 men from Denver and Kansas City pooled their resources to develop a claim they called the Dry Creek Venture. They built a small stamp mill, sank an exploratory shaft, and waited for the silver that geological surveys had promised. The silver never materialized. After 8 months of disappointing yields, the investors voted to abandon the project. They sold their equipment at a loss, boarded up the shaft entrance, and returned to their respective cities. The Dry Creek Venture was a footnote, barely remembered even by local historians. Within 18 months, Nicholas Creede would discover his bonanza less than half a mile from the abandoned works. The Commodore mine opened in 1892, eventually becoming one of Creede's most productive operations. It employed hundreds of men and operated continuously for nearly 2 decades. Like all hard rock mines of the era, it claimed lives. Cave-ins, equipment failures, blasting accidents, and silicosis created a steady procession of funerals in the canyon. But something about the pattern of deaths at the Commodore troubled those who kept records. A company clerk named Albert Hoffman first noticed the anomaly in 1905. Hoffman was responsible for maintaining death benefits paperwork, the modest payments made to widows and orphans of miners killed in the line of duty. As part of his duties, he kept a running tally of fatalities and their survivors. In a letter to his brother preserved in the Denver Public Library's Western History Collection, Hoffman described his growing unease. "I have counted 44 widows since 1901, he wrote. 44 exactly. The number struck me as familiar, though I could not say why. Then I remembered the Dry Creek papers. Hoffman had access to the mine's historical archives, which included documentation from the failed 1889 venture. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, he retrieved the original investor roster and compared it to his widow registry. The numbers matched. 44 investors had abandoned the Dry Creek venture. 44 miners had died at the Commodore between 1901 and 1905, leaving 44 widows. But the correspondence went deeper than simple arithmetic. Hoffman noticed that the first widow on his list, a woman named Anna Bergstrom, shared her maiden name's first letter with the first investor on the Dry Creek roster, a Kansas City banker named Jonathan Bartlett. The second widow, whose maiden name was Caldwell, corresponded to the second investor, a man named Thomas Crenshaw. The pattern continued through all 44 entries. Each widow's maiden name began with the same letter as the surname of the corresponding investor, in exact sequential order. "I checked my figures 3 times," Hoffman wrote. "I obtained the original marriage certificates to verify the maiden names. The alignment is perfect. I do not know what to make of this." Hoffman shared his discovery with the mine's superintendent, a practical Welshman named David Rees. According to Hoffman's account, Rees examined the documents for several minutes without speaking. Then he instructed Hoffman to destroy his comparison chart and never mention the matter again. Hoffman complied with the first order, but not the second. His letters to his brother continued to reference the widow count through 1907, when the 44th death occurred, completing the alphabetical sequence with a miner named Yardley, whose widow's maiden name was Young, matching the final investor on the Dry Creek list, Samuel Yates. A journalist named Eleanor Marsh attempted to investigate the pattern in 1923, nearly 2 decades after Hoffman's initial discovery. Marsh had obtained copies of Hoffman's letters and spent 3 weeks in Creede interviewing elderly residents who remembered the mining years. Her notes, donated to the University of Colorado's archive after her death in 1961, reveal the difficulties she encountered. The company records from 1901 through 1907 are incomplete, Marsh wrote. Several volumes of death certificates are missing from the county clerk's office. The Commodore Mine's personnel files for that period were reportedly destroyed in a warehouse fire in 1912. What remains is fragmentary. Marsh managed to verify 23 of Hoffman's 44 widow entries through church records, cemetery plots, and newspaper obituaries. In each case, she confirmed the alphabetical correspondence held. The remaining 21 cases could not be independently verified, but neither could they be disproven. One of Marsh's interview subjects was a retired school teacher named Harriet Lundgren, who had lived in Creede since 1894. Lundgren's husband had not worked in the mines, which may explain her willingness to speak candidly. Everyone knew about the count, Lundgren told Marsh. The wives talked about it among themselves. They noticed the pattern before any clerk did. But what could they say? Who would believe them? And what difference would it make? The men were dead either way. Lundgren mentioned a detail that Hoffman's letters had not recorded. According to her, the deaths did not occur randomly throughout the years in question. They clustered around specific dates, particularly the anniversary of the Dry Creek Venture's formal dissolution, which had been recorded as March 15, 1889. More men died in March than any other month, Lundgren said. The foreman knew it. They tried to reduce crews during that period, but it never seemed to help. Marsh attempted to locate descendants of the original 44 Dry Creek investors. She found relatives of 11 scattered across Kansas, Missouri, and Colorado. None had any knowledge of the Commodore mine or its fatality patterns. Several expressed confusion about why their ancestors' failed investment from decades earlier would be relevant to anything. One descendant, a retired attorney in Topeka named Richard Bartlett, grandson of Jonathan Bartlett, the first name on the investor list, provided an unsettling piece of information. According to family records, the elder Bartlett had received a letter in February 1901, shortly before the Commodore deaths began. The letter bore a Creede postmark, but contained no return address and no signature. Its message was 3 words: "The debt remains." Bartlett told Marsh that his grandfather had dismissed the letter as a prank or a case of mistaken identity. He died of natural causes in 1918, having never returned to Colorado. The Commodore mine closed in 1985 after nearly a century of intermittent operation. Its tunnels are now flooded, and the surface works have largely been dismantled. Creede itself survives as a quiet tourist town, its population hovering around 300, a far cry from the 10,000 who once crowded its canyon. The Mineral County Historical Society maintains a small archive of mining-era documents, including partial personnel records from several local operations. A volunteer archivist named Thomas Riley attempted to reconstruct Hoffman's widow count in 2004, using whatever sources remained available. Riley confirmed 31 of the 44 cases with reasonable certainty. His research also uncovered a detail that Hoffman had apparently not known. The Dry Creek Venture's original claim boundaries, as filed with the county recorder in 1889, corresponded almost exactly to the sections of the Commodore mine where the 44 fatal accidents occurred. The men died in the same ground the investors had abandoned, Riley wrote in his unpublished summary, not adjacent to it, not nearby. The same shafts, the same drifts, the same tunnels that the Dry Creek operation had originally opened and then sealed. Riley presented his findings to the Historical Society's board in 2005. The board voted to table the matter indefinitely. Riley resigned the following month. No memorial in Creede acknowledges the 44 miners or their widows. The Dry Creek Venture appears in no published history of the region. The alphabetical correspondence between two lists separated by 12 years and connected by nothing but geography has never been explained, investigated, or officially acknowledged. But in the Mineral County Courthouse, a locked cabinet contains the original marriage certificates that Albert Hoffman examined more than a century ago. A researcher who accessed the cabinet in 2011 reported that 44 files were present, arranged in alphabetical order by maiden name. The 45th slot in the sequence was empty. Its label, typed on a card that appeared to date from the early 1900s, read simply, "Reserved." The Commodore mine created no widows after 1907. The deaths resumed briefly in 1912, paused again, and continued sporadically until the operation's final closure. But the 44 names from those 6 years remain distinct in the company's surviving records, set apart, unexplained, and alphabetized by a system that no living person designed. He was not measuring ore. He was measuring what the ore remembered. The Tomboy mine operated high above Telluride, Colorado, at an elevation exceeding 11,000 feet. To reach it, workers traveled a precarious road carved into the face of Imogene Pass, a route so treacherous that mules occasionally stepped off the edge and fell 2,000 feet to the valley floor. In winter, avalanches buried the path for weeks at a time, stranding the miners in a small company town perched on the mountainside like a forgotten outpost. The mine opened in 1880 and produced silver and gold for more than 30 years. At its peak, the Tomboy employed over 1,000 men and maintained its own boarding houses, a schoolhouse, and a general store. The company town had electricity before most of rural Colorado. It had a tennis court, but it also had a reputation that the company's promotional materials never mentioned. Workers called it the Quiet Mine, not because it was peaceful, but because sound behaved strangely in its deepest tunnels. Experienced miners, men who had worked claims from Nevada to Montana, reported that the Tomboy's lower levels absorbed noise in ways they could not explain. Pickaxes struck rock without echoing. Shouts faded within feet of leaving a man's mouth. Some workers described a pressure in their ears that suggested great depth, even though the mine's lowest point was only 1,600 feet below the surface, modest by the standards of the era. The assay office sat near the mine's main entrance, a small wooden structure where ore samples were tested for precious metal content. Assaying was precise work, conducted by trained chemists who weighed, burned, and analyzed rock to determine its value. The Tomboy employed 3 assayers between 1902 and 1911, overseen by a chief assayer named Franklin Yoder. Yoder had worked for the United States Geological Survey before taking the Tomboy position. His credentials were impeccable. His references described him as methodical, skeptical, and unusually observant. He was not prone to speculation or superstition, which made his final report all the more difficult to dismiss. On the night of April 3, 1911, the Tomboy Assay Office caught fire. The cause was officially listed as an overturned kerosene lamp, though several witnesses reported that the flames burned with an unusual color, pale blue rather than orange, and produced no smoke visible against the night sky. The building was destroyed within an hour. Yoder was not present. He had descended to Telluride 2 days earlier on personal business. When Yoder learned of the fire, he reportedly expressed relief rather than dismay. According to a letter he sent to a former colleague at the Geological Survey, the destruction meant that the measurements would not need to be explained, but the measurements survived. Yoder had deposited a sealed copy of his final report in a Denver bank vault 6 months before the fire, with instructions that it should not be opened until after his death. He died in 1938, and the vault was opened by his only surviving relative, a nephew named Carroll Hughes. Hughes donated the document to the Colorado School of Mines Library in 1952, where it remains in the Restricted Collections Archive. The report is 47 pages long. The first 30 pages contained standard assay results: silver concentrations, gold traces, lead percentages. The data is unremarkable. The final 17 pages document something else entirely. Beginning in 1908, Yoder had conducted a private study of what he termed acoustic weight in the Tomboy's lower tunnels. Using equipment he designed himself, a modified balance scale connected to a series of tuning forks, he attempted to measure the physical properties of sound at various depths within the mine. His methodology was unorthodox. His conclusions were stranger still. According to Yoder's data, sound waves in the Tomboy's deepest sections exhibited measurable mass. A tone produced at the surface weighed nothing, as expected. The same tone produced at 800 feet below the surface registered a weight of approximately 0.03 grams. At 1,200 feet, the weight increased to 0.07 grams. At 1,600 feet, the mine's lowest accessible point, a single sustained tone weighed nearly a quarter gram. I have repeated these measurements over 400 times across a period of 26 months, Yoder wrote. The results are consistent within a margin of error of less than 2%. I do not understand what I am measuring. I am certain only that I am measuring something real. Yoder noted that the weight varied depending on the pitch of the sound. Lower frequencies gained mass more rapidly than higher ones. Human voices, which occupy a middle range, exhibited the most pronounced effect. A single spoken word at 1,600 feet weighed more than a gram, heavier than the air required to produce it. He also observed that the weight persisted after the sound stopped. If a tuning fork was struck at depth and then immediately brought to the surface, it continued to register excess weight for several minutes before gradually returning to normal. The sound, Yoder theorized, left something behind in the metal. The report contained one additional finding that Yoder marked with a handwritten asterisk. In January 1910, he conducted an experiment in which he recorded his own voice speaking a single sentence at each of the mine's 7 levels. When he played the recordings back in his surface laboratory, the deeper recordings exhibited a delay. Not in the playback mechanism, Yoder checked and rechecked his equipment, but in the sound itself. The words seemed to arrive later than they should have, as if traveling a greater distance than the air between the speaker and his ears. At the deepest level, Yoder wrote, the delay exceeded 3 seconds. I spoke, I waited, and then I heard myself speak. Yoder did not return to the Tomboy after the fire. He took a position with a private mining consultancy in Arizona and never again worked underground. His personal correspondence, also preserved in the Colorado School of Mines archive, contains no further references to acoustic weight after 1912. But 3 other men read Yoder's report during the decades it sat in the Denver vault. The first was Yoder's attorney, a man named Elias Whitmore, who reviewed the document in 1911 as part of the vault deposit process. Whitmore retired from legal practice in 1914, citing persistent health problems. His medical records, obtained by a researcher in 1987, indicate that he complained of auditory displacement, hearing his own voice on a delay of 1 to 2 seconds for the final 8 years of his life. The second reader was a bank officer named Gordon Sawyer, who inventoried the vault's contents in 1929. Sawyer left the bank the following year to manage a family farm in Nebraska. Letters to his wife, written during his final illness in 1941, describe his frustration with what he called the echo that won't stop. He heard himself speaking, he wrote, approximately 3 seconds after the words left his mouth. Doctors found no physiological cause. The third reader was Carroll Hughes, Yoder's nephew, who opened the vault in 1938. Hughes was a mining engineer by training, fully capable of understanding his uncle's methodology. He donated the report to the Colorado School of Mines, but refused to discuss its contents with researchers. In 1964, Hughes was interviewed for an oral history project about Colorado mining families. The transcript notes that Hughes spoke unusually slowly, with long pauses between sentences. When the interviewer asked about this, Hughes replied, "I'm waiting for my words to catch up." Hughes died in 1970. His obituary mentioned no unusual circumstances. The Tomboy mine closed in 1928. The company town was abandoned, its buildings left to collapse under the weight of mountain winters. Today, only foundations and scattered debris remain, accessible by 4-wheel drive vehicles during the brief summer months when the pass is clear. Hikers who visit the site occasionally report an odd acoustic phenomenon near the sealed mine entrance. Sound seems muffled there, they say. Voices don't carry. One visitor, writing in a hiking forum in 2016, described clapping his hands and hearing the sound return a half-beat late, like a recording that wasn't synced properly. The Colorado School of Mines restricts access to Yoder's report. Researchers must submit a formal request and sign a liability waiver that does not specify what liability is being waived. A librarian who processed such requests between 2008 and 2015 reported that approximately 3 researchers per year asked to see the document. None of them, she noted, ever requested it twice. In the archive's catalog, Yoder's report is listed under a title he apparently chose himself. It does not reference silver or gold or any mineral content. The title is 4 words, "The Weight of Echo." A handwritten note on the final page, added in ink that appears older than the typescript, contains a single instruction that Yoder never explained. Read silently. Do not speak the measurements aloud. The Tomboy mine produced over $26 million in ore during its operational years. Its assay records are considered reliable by modern standards. But the final 17 pages of Franklin Yoder's report have never been incorporated into any geological survey cited in any academic paper or replicated by any subsequent researcher. The measurements remain unverified, not because they have been disproven, but because no one has been willing to repeat them. The mountain kept count. The miners just wrote it down. St. Elmo sits at the end of a dirt road in Chaffee County, Colorado, at an elevation of 10,000 feet. In summer, the town receives a steady trickle of tourists who come to photograph its weathered wooden buildings and browse its single gift shop. In winter, the road becomes impassable, and St. Elmo returns to the silence that has defined it for over a century. Fewer than 10 people live there year-round. Most of the structures are abandoned, preserved by the dry mountain air and the absence of anyone to tear them down. The town exists because of the Mary Murphy mine. Opened in 1875, the Mary Murphy produced gold, silver, and lead from a vein that ran deep into Chrysolite Mountain. At its peak, the operation employed over 300 workers and maintained its own boarding houses, a company store, and a narrow-gauge railroad that carried ore down to the smelters in Romley. The mine operated continuously for nearly 50 years, surviving silver crashes, labor disputes, and the gradual exodus that emptied most of Colorado's high-altitude mining camps. What made the Mary Murphy unusual was not its output or its longevity. It was the temperature. Underground mines are typically warm. The deeper one descends, the hotter the rock becomes, a phenomenon caused by the Earth's internal heat. In most operations, ventilation systems work constantly to push cool air into the tunnels and draw warm air out. Miners expect the underground environment to be stable, predictable, and largely independent of surface conditions. The Mary Murphy did not follow these rules. A foreman named Cyrus Whitfield began keeping temperature logs in the spring of 1875, shortly after the mine opened. His stated purpose was practical. He wanted to monitor ventilation efficiency and identify potential problem areas before they became dangerous. Whitfield recorded readings from 6 fixed locations throughout the mine, noting the date, time, and temperature in a leather-bound ledger that he stored in his office near the main shaft entrance. The logs continued after Whitfield's retirement in 1891. His successors maintained the practice with varying degrees of diligence, but the basic methodology remained consistent. Twice daily readings from the same 6 locations, recorded in the same format, stored in the same series of ledgers. By 1903, the collection spanned 28 volumes. A company accountant named Raymond Jessup first noticed the pattern that year. Jessup had been asked to inventory the mine's records as part of a corporate reorganization, and he spent several weeks cataloging documents that had accumulated over 3 decades of operation. The temperature logs were supposed to be routine, background data with no financial significance. Instead, Jessup found something that kept him awake for the rest of his life. The average underground temperature at the Mary Murphy in 1875 was 52 degrees Fahrenheit. In 1876, it rose to 53 degrees. In 1877, it dropped back to 52. In 1878, it rose again to 53. The fluctuations seemed random until Jessup cross-referenced them with another set of records, the mine's death registry. In 1875, 1 miner had died in the Mary Murphy. The temperature rose 1 degree. In 1876, no miners died. The temperature fell 1 degree. In 1877, 2 miners died. The temperature rose 2 degrees. The correlation was perfect. Jessup checked the data repeatedly. He recalculated averages, examined individual readings for errors, and compared the temperature logs against external weather records to rule out surface influence. The pattern held. For 28 consecutive years, the Mary Murphy's underground temperature had increased by exactly 1 degree for every death and decreased by exactly 1 degree for every year without a fatality. By 1903, 26 miners had died inside the Mary Murphy. The average underground temperature was 61 degrees, precisely 9 degrees warmer than it had been at the mine's opening. Jessup included his findings in his inventory report, buried in an appendix that he assumed no one would read. The company's management did not respond, and Jessup never raised the matter again. But he kept a personal copy of his calculations, which his daughter donated to the Colorado Historical Society in 1967. The temperature logs continued after Jessup's discovery. So did the pattern. A mining engineer named Wallace Trumbull reviewed the logs in 1915 as part of a ventilation assessment. His notes, preserved in the Mary Murphy collection at the Denver Public Library, confirm that the correlation had held for an additional 12 years. The underground temperature had reached 64 degrees. The death count had reached 29. Trumbull's notes include a single sentence that he later crossed out, but remains partially legible. It is as if the mountain is keeping a ledger of its own. The Mary Murphy closed in 1922, a casualty of declining ore grades and rising operational costs. By that point, the underground temperature had reached 68 degrees. 33 miners had died inside the mine. The correlation remained unbroken across 47 years of continuous operation. The temperature logs were transferred to the Colorado School of Mines Library in 1938, along with other company records. A graduate student named Eleanor Vasquez attempted to study them in 1954 as part of her thesis on underground climate patterns. Her findings were never published. Her thesis advisor, a professor named Donald Harrington, recommended that she abandon the project entirely. In a letter to the department chair, Harrington explained his reasoning. Miss Vasquez's data is internally consistent, but scientifically inexplicable, he wrote. More troubling is the behavior of the documents themselves. When examined in the archive's reading room, all temperature readings display a constant value of 61 degrees, regardless of the date or location recorded. This contradicts the variance clearly visible in photographic reproductions of the same pages. I do not believe this phenomenon merits further investigation. Vasquez transferred to a different program the following semester. She eventually completed a degree in library science and never returned to geological research. Other researchers encountered similar difficulties. A historian named Bernard Kowalski requested access to the logs in 1971 while writing a book about Colorado mining towns. His research notes describe his confusion. The temperature readings are all identical, Kowalski wrote, 61 degrees every entry across all 28 volumes. But the handwriting clearly changes from page to page, different foremen, different decades, different inks. The numbers should vary, they don't. Kowalski contacted the Archives Preservation Department to inquire about possible document restoration or alteration. The department had no record of any work performed on the Mary Murphy collection. A physicist at the University of Denver, named Margaret Stanton, attempted a more rigorous analysis in 1988. Stanton brought a digital thermometer to the archive and placed it directly on several pages of the temperature logs, reasoning that any physical anomaly might be measurable. The thermometer read 61 degrees. Stanton moved the device to other documents in the reading room. It registered normal ambient temperature, approximately 68 degrees. She returned to the Mary Murphy logs, 61 degrees. The paper itself is cold, Stanton noted in her journal, noticeably cold. But only these documents. I cannot explain how paper stored at room temperature for 50 years maintains a temperature 7 degrees below its environment. Stanton published no papers on her findings. She retired in 2001 and declined interview requests until her death in 2019. The Mary Murphy mine remains sealed. The tunnels have flooded over the past century, and the entrance has collapsed under the weight of accumulated winters. St. Elmo's few remaining residents do not discuss the mine's history with tourists. A gift shop owner named Ruth Dennison, who has lived in St. Elmo since 1973, reportedly keeps a framed photograph of the Mary Murphy head frame behind her counter. When asked about the mine, she provides a standard summary: dates of operation, total output, names of notable foremen. When asked about the temperature logs, she says nothing. A hiker passing through St. Elmo in 2014 recorded a brief conversation with Dennison in his travel blog. He had asked why the town felt so cold, even in August. "The mountain remembers," Dennison reportedly replied. "It remembers everything it took." The temperature logs remain in the Colorado School of Mines archive. Access requires written permission from the department chair. The catalog entry includes a note added in 1992, author unknown. All readings normalized to 61 degrees. Variance documentation available upon request. No variance documentation exists in the archive's holdings. Requests for it have been returned unanswered since at least 2003, 61 degrees. The temperature the Mary Murphy recorded in 1903, when Raymond Jessup first discovered the pattern. The year he told no one what he had found. The year the mountain learned that someone was watching. The Mary Murphy mine produced over $14 million in ore during its 47 years of operation. Its temperature logs are considered unreliable by modern archival standards, though no specific errors have ever been identified. The 33 men who died inside the mountain are buried in cemeteries scattered across 3 Colorado counties. Their graves, when measured, register normal ground temperature. The paper that recorded their deaths does not. They counted because counting was how you knew who the mountain had kept. The Cornish came to Colorado in waves during the 1860s, recruited from the tin mines of Cornwall, England, where their families had worked underground for generations. They brought with them expertise that American miners lacked, knowledge of hard rock extraction, timbering techniques, and the particular instincts required to survive in tunnels where the earth pressed close. They also brought traditions. One of these traditions was the count. At the end of every shift, Cornish miners assembled at the shaft entrance and counted themselves aloud before ascending. The practice served a practical purpose, ensuring that no man was left behind in the labyrinth of drifts and crosscuts, but it also carried older significance. In Cornwall, the count was a ritual of return, a confirmation that the underground had released what it had borrowed for the day. The Gunnell mine opened in 1864, part of the gold rush that transformed Gilpin County into one of the wealthiest regions in the American West. Central City, the county seat, called itself the richest square mile on earth. The Gunnell was among the most productive operations in the district, employing a workforce that peaked at over 200 men during the boom years. Most of those men were Cornish. A shift captain named Thomas Polglace supervised the Gunnell's deepest workings from 1867 to 1878. His daily logs, preserved in the Gilpin County Historical Society's archive, document 11 years of routine operations, ore tonnage, equipment repairs, supply requisitions, and personnel matters. But beginning in 1868, Polglace's entries include a recurring notation that he never explained. Count discrepancy, 32 down, 33 up. The first entry appeared on March 14, 1868. Polglace recorded that 32 men had descended for the morning shift, verified by his own tally at the shaft collar. When the shift ended 8 hours later, the same men assembled for the count. 33 voices answered. Polglace did not identify which man was extra. His log simply noted the discrepancy and continued with the day's production figures. The notation appeared again on April 2nd, then April 19th. By the end of 1868, Polglace had recorded the count discrepancy on 23 separate occasions. In every instance, the numbers were the same. 32 descended, 33 emerged. A reasonable explanation would be clerical error, Polglace miscounting on the way down, or a worker joining mid-shift from another part of the mine. But the Gunnell's payroll records, also preserved in the county archive, show no corresponding irregularities. 32 men were paid for each of the shifts in question. 32 names appeared on the daily assignment rosters. No 33rd man ever collected wages, signed a timesheet, or appeared in any official documentation. Polglace apparently attempted to identify the extra miner on several occasions. A note from November 1869 describes his methodology. Conducted visual inspection during ascent, counted each man as he emerged from the cage, 33, recognized all faces, knew all names, cannot account for the additional. A fellow shift captain named William Chegwidden corroborated the phenomenon in a letter to his brother in Cornwall, dated January 1871. Polglaze has asked me to observe the count, Chegwidden wrote. I watched the men go down myself, 32. I watched them come up, 33. I know these men. I drink with them on Saturdays. There were 33 of them coming out of that hole, and I cannot tell you which one should not have been there. Chegwidden's letter includes a detail that Polglaze's logs omitted. According to Chegwidden, the Cornish miners themselves were aware of the discrepancy but refused to discuss it directly. They referred to the phenomenon obliquely, using a term from the old country, the knocker's share. In Cornish mining folklore, knockers were spirits that inhabited underground spaces. They were not malevolent. Miners generally considered them protective, but they demanded acknowledgement. A knocker's share was the portion of anything that belonged to the unseen. A crust of bread left in the tunnel, a splash of tea poured onto the rock, a place at the count that was never questioned. The men say it is bad luck to count too carefully, Chegwidden wrote. They say the extra man is not for us to name. The discrepancy continued through the 1870s. Polglaze recorded it over 140 times between 1868 and 1878. The numbers never varied, 32 down, 33 up. The extra man was never identified, never photographed, never described in any physical detail. In 1878, the gunnel's owners commissioned a series of improvements to modernize the operation. Among these was the installation of mechanical counting turnstiles at the shaft collar, iron gates that clicked and registered each body passing through, eliminating the possibility of human error. Polglaze's logs from December 1878 record the turnstile's arrival. His tone is notably flat. Counting machines installed per company directive, operational beginning Monday. The turnstiles began operation on January 6, 1879. Polglaze's log entry for that day is brief. Turnstile count accurate, 32 down, 32 up, no discrepancy. The mine collapsed on January 13th. The cave-in occurred without warning, deep in the gunnel's lowest level, in a section that geological surveys had deemed stable for years. 16 men were killed instantly. Another 8 died before rescue teams could reach them. The collapse sealed over 400 feet of tunnel and rendered the mine's deepest workings permanently inaccessible. An investigation by the Colorado Territorial Mining Board attributed the disaster to unforeseen geological instability. The report noted that the collapse zone showed evidence of unusual stress patterns, as if the rock had been bearing a weight that suddenly shifted. The turnstiles survived the disaster, still mounted at the shaft collar when the rescue operations concluded. A company accountant named Harold Fitzroy examined their mechanical counters as part of the post-collapse audit. His report, filed with the mining board but never publicized, noted an anomaly. The turnstile at the shaft's entrance showed 32 descents on the morning of January 13th. The turnstile at the exit, which should have registered 0 since no one had emerged before the collapse, showed a single count. One person had exited the mine before the cave-in occurred. The turnstile logged the time as 6:47 in the morning, approximately 3 hours before the collapse. No corresponding descent was recorded. No worker reported leaving early. No one on the surface remembered seeing anyone emerge. Thomas Polglaze was not among the dead. He had taken the morning off to attend a funeral in Central City. When he learned of the disaster, he returned to the mine immediately and worked without rest for 36 hours coordinating rescue efforts. His final log entry, dated January 15, 1879, reads, "Recovery operation suspended, 24 lost, count verified." Polglaze resigned from the gunnel 3 weeks later. He returned to Cornwall and never worked in mining again. His descendants, interviewed by a historian in 1984, reported that he refused to discuss Colorado for the rest of his life, except for one comment he made to his eldest son shortly before his death in 1902. "We should never have stopped counting wrong," Polglay said. "The 33rd man was the one keeping the rest of us safe." The Gunnell mine partially reopened in 1881 under new ownership. The counting turnstiles were removed and never replaced. Later records show no further count discrepancies, but they also show a marked increase in worker turnover. Cornish miners, in particular, refused to return. The mine closed permanently in 1917. Its surface works have largely disappeared, absorbed into the landscape of a region that has transformed from industrial boomtown to historic tourist destination. Central City now operates casinos where stamping mills once stood. A single turnstile from the Gunnells survives, donated to the Gilpin County Historical Society in 1942 by a family who found it in a barn they had purchased. The turnstile's mechanical counter remains frozen at a count of 1. The Society's records indicate that the counter was stuck when the turnstile arrived. Attempts to reset it have failed. A maintenance note from 1973 observes that the mechanism appears functional but refuses to advance, as if waiting for someone to pass through first. The Gunnell mine produced over $4 million in gold during its operational years. 24 men died in the 1879 collapse. Their names are inscribed on a memorial in the Central City Cemetery, arranged in alphabetical order. There are 24 names on the stone. But visitors who count them sometimes report reaching 25, though when they count again, the number is always correct. They all saw the child. None of them could explain why the child saw them first. The Sunnyside mine clings to the mountainside above Silverton, Colorado, at an elevation exceeding 12,000 feet. The town itself sits in a valley so remote that for decades the only reliable access was by train, a narrow-gauge line that wound through canyons where avalanches routinely buried the tracks each winter. Silverton never had more than a few thousand residents, even during the mining boom, but what it lacked in population, it made up for in ore. The mountains surrounding the town contained some of the richest silver and gold deposits in the American West. The Sunnyside was among the largest operations in the district. Opened in 1873, it eventually extended over 5 miles of tunnels into Bonita Peak, employing hundreds of men across multiple levels. The work was dangerous even by the standards of the era. High altitude made breathing difficult. The ore contained traces of arsite that irritated lungs and eyes, and the tunnels themselves were prone to the accumulation of gases that no ventilation system could entirely prevent. On the morning of August 19, 1906, a pocket of methane ignited in the Sunnyside's 4th level. The explosion killed 24 men instantly, collapsing over 300 feet of tunnel and sending a shockwave through adjacent drifts that knocked workers off their feet nearly a quarter mile away. The disaster made national news. Rescue operations continued for 6 days, though hope of finding survivors in the collapsed section ended within the first 12 hours. The bodies were recovered over the following weeks, identified by personal effects when physical recognition was impossible. The San Juan County coroner, a physician named Oliver Bradshaw, conducted the official inquest. His duties extended beyond examining the dead. He was also responsible for collecting testimony from survivors who might shed light on the explosion's cause. Between August 21st and September 15th, Bradshaw interviewed 32 miners who had been working in the Sunnyside on the morning of the blast. 7 of those interviews contained details that Bradshaw chose not to include in his official report. The 7 men had been working in different sections of the mine, spread across 3 levels and separated by hundreds of feet of rock. After the explosion, they were evacuated to different medical facilities. 4 to a hospital in Silverton, 2 to a larger facility in Durango, and 1 to a sanitarium in Pueblo where he was being treated for burns. Bradshaw interviewed each man separately. He did not share their statements with one another or inform them of what others had reported. His interview protocols, preserved in the Colorado State Archives, confirmed that each conversation was conducted independently, with no opportunity for collaboration or contamination. All 7 men described seeing a child in the moments before the explosion. The first account came from a timberman named Gustav Lindqvist, interviewed in Silverton on August 23rd. Lindqvist had been reinforcing support beams approximately 200 feet from the blast zone when he noticed movement at the far end of his drift. "I saw a small figure standing where the tunnel curved," Lindqvist stated. "A child, I thought, though I knew that was impossible. Children are not permitted underground. The figure was holding something, a cage, the kind we use for canaries. It stood perfectly still. Then it raised one finger to its lips, like this." Lindqvist demonstrated the gesture, a single finger pressed vertically against closed lips. 3 seconds later, the world exploded. Lindqvist estimated the child's height at approximately 4 feet. He could not determine the child's gender or age with certainty. He described the figure's clothing as gray, like the rock, and noted that the child's face was obscured by shadow despite the presence of his carbide lamp. The second account came from a mucker named Patrick Brennan, interviewed in Durango on August 26th. Brennan had been loading ore into a cart on the 3rd level, 1 level above the blast zone, when he experienced what he described as a feeling of being watched. "I turned around and there was a child at the end of the drift," Brennan stated, "just standing there, holding a bird cage. I started to call out, to ask what in God's name a child was doing down here, but before I could speak, the child raised a finger to its lips, telling me to be quiet. Then the floor dropped out from under me." Brennan suffered a broken leg and 3 fractured ribs when the shockwave threw him against his ore cart. He was unconscious for several hours after the explosion and initially attributed the child to a hallucination. But he insisted to Bradshaw that he had seen the figure before losing consciousness, not after. The remaining 5 accounts were nearly identical. Each man described a child of indeterminate age and gender, standing motionless at the far end of their respective tunnels, holding a canary cage. Each man reported that the child raised a finger to its lips immediately before the blast. The gesture was consistent across all 7 testimonies, a single finger pressed vertically against the mouth, requesting silence. None of the 7 men had children of their own. Bradshaw verified this detail through company personnel records. None of them knew each other well enough to have discussed the sighting before their interviews. And none of them could explain how a child had appeared simultaneously in 7 different locations spread across 3 levels of the mine. Bradshaw's personal notes, discovered in his grandson's possession in 1982, reveal his struggle to reconcile the testimonies. "I am a man of science," Bradshaw wrote. "I do not believe in apparitions or spirits, but I have interviewed 7 men separately across 3 weeks, and they have described the same impossible thing. I cannot include these accounts in my official report. No one would accept them, but I cannot dismiss them either. These men saw something. I am certain of that." Bradshaw's official report attributed the explosion to methane accumulation and inadequate ventilation. It made no mention of the child or the testimonies describing it. The 7 witness statements were filed separately in a folder marked Supplementary Materials, Not for Publication. The folder remained in Bradshaw's personal files until his death in 1929. His grandson, a retired schoolteacher named Martin Bradshaw, attempted to donate the documents to the Colorado State Archives in 1983. The archives accepted the materials but classified them as restricted without explanation. A researcher named Vivian Gutierrez obtained access to the testimonies in 2007 while writing a history of San Juan County mining disasters. Her book, published in 2009, included a brief chapter on the Sunnyside explosion, but did not mention the child sightings. In an interview with a local newspaper, Gutierrez explained her omission. "I read the testimonies," she said. "I believe the men were sincere, but I couldn't verify any of it, and I couldn't explain it. Sometimes a historian has to acknowledge the limits of what can be responsibly reported." Gutierrez did note one detail that Bradshaw's original notes had not emphasized. The Sunnyside mine used canaries as gas detectors, a common practice in coal and hard rock mines throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. The birds were kept in small cages and carried into the tunnels. If dangerous gases accumulated, the canary would die before the concentration became lethal to humans, giving miners time to evacuate. On the morning of August 19, 1906, the Sunnyside's canaries were being kept in a storage area near the main shaft entrance, nowhere close to the locations where the 7 miners reported seeing the child. All 12 canaries survived the explosion. The storage area was undamaged. The birds were examined by a veterinarian in Silverton the following week. His report, also preserved in the state archives, noted that the canaries appeared healthy, but exhibited unusual behavior. They refused to sing. A canary that does not sing is typically a sign of stress or environmental disturbance, but the veterinarian found no physical cause. The birds remained silent for the rest of their lives. The last one died in 1912. None of them ever sang again. The Sunnyside mine continued operations until 1991, when environmental concerns and declining ore prices forced its closure. The tunnels where the 1906 explosion occurred were sealed decades earlier, too unstable for further extraction. A memorial plaque near the old entrance lists the names of the 24 men who died. Visitors to the site occasionally report unusual experiences. A hiking guide named Samuel Ortega, who leads tours of the Silverton area, mentioned in a 2015 interview that clients sometimes ask about the child near the mine. "I've never seen anything myself," Ortega said, "but every few summers someone will come back from a hike near the Sunnyside and ask if there's a family living up there. They say they saw a kid standing by the old entrance, just standing there, not moving. I tell them no one lives up there. No one's lived up there for 30 years. Ortega paused before adding a final detail. "They always say the same thing about the kid, that it was holding something. A cage, they think, a small cage with something inside." The coroner's supplementary folder remains in the Colorado State Archives. Access requires written permission from the state archivist. The 7 original testimonies are stored in acid-free sleeves, their handwriting faded but legible. Each statement ends with the same notation, added in Bradshaw's handwriting. Witness was sober. Witness was coherent. Witness maintains account under repeated questioning. At the bottom of Gustav Lindqvist's statement, Bradshaw added a final line that appears nowhere else in the file. Asked witness why he thought the child gestured for silence. Witness replied, "Because the child already knew what was coming, and there was nothing left to say." The Sunnyside mine explosion of 1906 remains one of the deadliest industrial accidents in Colorado history. Its cause has never been disputed. Its 24 victims have never been forgotten. But the 7 men who survived, who saw what they saw and said what they said, left behind a question that Oliver Bradshaw could not answer and Vivian Gutierrez could not publish. Why would a warning come in a form that no one could understand until it was already too late? The company paid him for 9 years. No one could say what he looked like. Caribou sits 10 miles west of Nederland, Colorado, at an elevation just under 10,000 feet. The town no longer exists in any meaningful sense. A few collapsed structures, some scattered foundations, and a road that disintegrates into wilderness before reaching the old mine works. In the 1870s, it was one of the most productive silver camps in the Colorado Territory, home to nearly 4,000 residents and the site of a strike so rich that investors from New York and London bought shares sight unseen. The Caribou Mine opened in 1869 after a prospector named Samuel Conger discovered a silver vein while hunting deer on the mountain's western slope. Within a year, the operation employed over 300 men and produced ore valued at more than $50,000 per month. The company built boarding houses, a company store, and a small hospital to serve workers injured in the increasingly deep tunnels. Like all mines of the era, the Caribou kept meticulous personnel records. Payroll ledgers documented every worker's name, position, wages, and attendance. Boarding house registers tracked who slept where. Shift logs recorded who descended into the mountain and when they emerged. These documents were essential for operations, for taxation, and for the grim task of notifying families when accidents claimed their men. The records were also how investigators eventually discovered J. Verity. A labor historian named Constance Farrow first encountered the name in 1961 while researching mining conditions in territorial Colorado. Farrow had obtained access to the Caribou Mine's surviving records housed at the University of Colorado's Norlin Library and was compiling data on wages and working hours when she noticed a peculiarity in the payroll ledgers. A worker listed as J. Verity appeared on the payroll beginning in March 1870 and continued through November 1879, the entire operational lifespan of the Caribou Mine's most productive period. Verity was classified as a general laborer, paid the standard rate of $3 per day, and collected his wages with perfect regularity every 2 weeks. The regularity itself was unusual. Mining was transient work. Men came and went with the seasons, following strikes, fleeing debts, or simply growing tired of the altitude and the danger. A worker who remained on the same payroll for 9 consecutive years was exceptional. Farrow made a note to investigate further. What she found made no sense. J. Verity's name appeared in multiple record systems. The boarding house register showed him renting a bed in dormitory 4 from 1870 to 1874, then transferring to a private room in the company's newer housing block. Supply requisitions bore his signature for candles, blasting caps, and replacement picks. The company store extended him a modest line of credit, which he paid down regularly without ever clearing completely. But J. Verity appeared in no photographs. The Caribou Mine was extensively documented during its operational years. Stereoscope images, formal portraits of management, and candid shots of workers posing at shaft entrances. Farrow examined every surviving photograph from the period. She found no one identified as Verity, and no one whose presence could not be otherwise accounted for. More troubling was the absence of physical description. Personnel records from the era typically included basic identifying information: height, weight, hair color, distinguishing marks. Verity's file contained none of these. The space reserved for physical description was blank. Farrow interviewed elderly residents of Nederland and Boulder who remembered the Caribou years or whose parents had worked there. None recalled a J. Verity. None recognized the name when prompted. Several noted that Verity was an unusual surname. It meant truth in Latin, and suggested they would have remembered such an odd name if they had encountered it. A retired mining engineer named Howard Christensen offered Farrow a different perspective. Christiansen's father had served as a shift foreman at the Caribou in the late 1870s, and family stories had occasionally referenced a payroll ghost. "My father said there was a name on the books that no one could put a face to," Christensen told Farrow in 1962. The men joked about it. They'd say, "Verity must be working the night shift," meaning someone was collecting pay for work they weren't doing. But my father checked. The shifts Verity signed in for were real shifts. The work got done, He just couldn't find anyone who remembered doing it. Farrow's research took a darker turn when she cross-referenced Verity's attendance records with the mine's accident reports. The Caribou Mine experienced 17 fatal accidents between 1870 and 1879. Cave-ins, equipment failures, blasting misfires, and falls claimed a total of 23 lives. The accidents were distributed across the 9-year period with no obvious pattern. Some years had multiple fatalities, others had none. But J. Verity's attendance showed a perfect correlation. On every shift during which a fatal accident occurred, Verity's name appeared on the sign-in log. He had been present, officially at least, for every death the mine recorded. And on the hundreds of shifts that passed without incident, Verity was absent. His name did not appear. He had not reported for work. The correlation was absolute. Farrow checked it repeatedly, engaging a graduate student to verify her findings independently. The pattern held. In 9 years of operation, J. Verity had never been present for a safe shift and had never been absent for a fatal one. Farrow's notes from this period reflect her growing unease. "I am confronted with two possibilities," she wrote. Either J. Verity possessed foreknowledge of every accident and chose to be present for each one, or J. Verity's presence somehow caused or accompanied the accidents. Neither explanation is acceptable. Neither can be dismissed. She attempted to determine what had happened to Verity after the mine's closure in 1879. The Caribou shut down following a series of fires and a sharp decline in silver prices, and most workers dispersed to other camps throughout the region. Payroll records from other Colorado mines showed no subsequent employment of anyone named J. Verity. Census records from 1880 contained no matching entry in Boulder County or anywhere in the territory. The boarding house register showed Verity checking out of his room on November 15, 1879, 2 days before the mine officially closed. His final pay voucher was collected on November 16th. The signature matched all previous vouchers. No one saw him leave. No one remembered where he went. No one could describe what he looked like when he walked out the door. A forensic document examiner named Philip Aguilar analyzed the Verity signatures in 1984 at the request of a documentary filmmaker researching Colorado ghost towns. Aguilar compared the signatures across the 9-year period, examining ink composition, pen pressure, and handwriting characteristics. His findings were inconclusive but troubling. The signatures are consistent with a single author, Aguilar reported. The handwriting shows natural variation across time, as expected, but there are anomalies I cannot explain. The pen pressure is unusually uniform, more uniform than any other signature set I've examined, and the ink appears to have aged at different rates on different documents, despite being applied to paper stored under identical conditions. Aguilar noted one additional detail. The name J. Verity never appeared in full anywhere in the records. The initial was always J, just the letter and a period. No first name was ever recorded. When Aguilar searched for common names beginning with J that might pair with Verity, he found none that appeared in any other Colorado record from the period. It's possible the name was invented, Aguilar concluded, a pseudonym for someone who wished to remain anonymous. But that raises its own questions. Why would someone maintain a false identity for 9 years? And why would that false identity be present only when men were about to die? The Caribou mine site is now part of the Roosevelt National Forest. The old workings have collapsed or been sealed for safety. Hikers occasionally pass through the area, though few realize they are walking through what was once one of Colorado's wealthiest towns. A Forest Service employee named Darren Kowalski mentioned to a local newspaper in 2003 that visitors sometimes reported finding old coins in the area, silver pieces from the territorial period, likely lost by miners over a century ago. Kowalski kept a small collection of these finds in his office, cataloged by date and location. One coin, discovered near the collapsed main shaft in 1997, was different from the others. It was a silver dollar dated 1879, the final year of the mine's operation. On the reverse side, someone had scratched 3 letters into the metal with a sharp implement. J.V.T. Kowalski assumed the initials stood for a miner's name. He searched historical records for anyone at the Caribou whose name matched those letters. The only candidate was J. Verity. The T remained unexplained. The coin is still in Kowalski's collection. He has never been able to determine what the third initial represents, though he has noted that in Latin, veritas is spelled with a T at the end. Truth. The full word would be truth. The payroll ledgers remain at the University of Colorado, available to researchers who request access through the archives. Constance Farrow never published her findings about J. Verity. Her research notes were donated to the library after her death in 1994, filed alongside the documents she had spent 3 decades trying to understand. A handwritten note in Farrow's papers, undated, contains what appears to be her final thought on the matter. I have searched for a man who collected 9 years of wages for attending 23 deaths. I do not believe he existed. I cannot prove he did not. The only thing I know with certainty is what his name means, and I am no longer sure that is a comfort. The Caribou mine produced over $8 million in silver during its decade of operation. Its records are considered complete and well preserved by archival standards. 23 men died in its tunnels between 1870 and 1879. Their names are documented. Their deaths are explained. But the name that appears beside theirs on every fatal shift log, the worker who came only when death came with him, remains unidentified, undescribed, and unexplained. J. Verity collected his final wages and walked out of history, leaving behind nothing but signatures and a question that no one has been able to answer. What kind of truth only shows itself when someone is about to die? The mountain answered him. It just didn't answer in the right order. The Bachelor Mine sits above the town of Creede, Colorado, carved into the slopes of the Continental Divide at an elevation exceeding 10,000 feet. The mine opened in 1891 during Creede's silver boom and operated intermittently for nearly 4 decades, producing ore from a vein that ran deep into the volcanic rock of the San Juan Mountains. At its peak, the Bachelor employed over 200 men and maintained tunnels extending more than a mile into the mountainside. The work was typical of hard rock mining in the high country, cold, dangerous, and poorly ventilated. But the Bachelor had a reputation that distinguished it from neighboring operations. Miners called it the quiet mine, not because it was silent, but because sound behaved strangely in its depths. Echoes in underground spaces are predictable. Sound waves travel outward from their source, reflect off tunnel walls, and return to the listener after a delay determined by distance and the speed of sound. In a typical mine, a shout might echo back in a fraction of a second, the timing consistent with the geometry of the surrounding rock. The Bachelor did not follow these rules. Workers reported that sounds took too long to return. A pickaxe striking ore would produce its echo several seconds later than expected, as if the sound had traveled much farther than the tunnel walls allowed. Some miners described hearing their own voices come back to them after they had already started speaking again, the delay so pronounced that conversations became disorienting. A shift foreman named Edgar Suttles documented these observations in his personal journal between 1912 and 1915. Suttles was not a scientist, but he was methodical. He timed echoes with his pocket watch, recording the delays at various locations throughout the mine and comparing them to distances he measured himself. The numbers do not agree, Suttles wrote in March 1914. At the 400-foot level, a sound should echo in approximately 0.7 seconds. I have measured delays of over 2 seconds. The sound is traveling somewhere it should not be able to go. Suttles shared his observations with the mine's management, suggesting that the unusual acoustics might indicate hidden cavities or structural weaknesses in the surrounding rock. The company hired a geological surveyor to investigate. The surveyor found no anomalies, no voids, no fissures, no explanation for the delayed echoes. His report, filed in August 1914, concluded with a single puzzled sentence. The acoustic phenomena reported by workers cannot be attributed to any identifiable geological feature. The cause remains undetermined. The matter might have ended there, relegated to the category of unexplained curiosities that accumulate in any old mine. But in 1917, a state mine inspector named Franklin Jessup arrived at the Bachelor to conduct a routine safety evaluation. Jessup was thorough. He examined timbering, ventilation, blasting procedures, and equipment maintenance. He interviewed workers about conditions and reviewed accident reports. And he brought with him a device that was still relatively novel in mining inspection, a portable phonograph recorder capable of capturing sound on wax cylinders. Jessup's stated purpose for the recorder was to document ambient noise levels at various depths, a method for assessing ventilation adequacy without relying solely on subjective reports. But his personal notes, preserved at the Colorado School of Mines library, suggest a secondary motivation. The men speak of strange echoes, Jessup wrote on the evening of his arrival. I intend to capture these phenomena for later analysis. On the morning of June 14, 1917, Jessup descended to the Bachelor's lowest accessible level, approximately 800 feet below the main entrance, and set up his recording equipment at the entrance to a drift that miners had identified as particularly anomalous. He positioned the phonograph's horn to capture both his voice and any returning echoes, started the cylinder rotating, and began to speak. He counted to 10. The original wax cylinder deteriorated over the following decades, but a transcription was made in 1943 by an acoustic researcher named Dorothy Hubbard, who was studying sound propagation in underground environments. Hubbard's transcription, along with her analysis notes, remains in the Colorado School of Mines archive. According to Hubbard, the recording begins normally. Jessup's voice counts forward, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. His diction is clear, his pacing steady. The counting takes approximately 8 seconds. Then, after a pause of nearly 4 seconds, the echo begins. But the echo does not count forward, it counts backward. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Hubbard noted that the reversed sequence was not simply a degraded or distorted version of the original. The pronunciation was identical to Jessup's, the same voice, the same timbre, the same regional accent. But the order was inverted, as if the sound had somehow reversed itself during its journey through the rock. More disturbing was what came after the countdown reached 1. The echo continued. It spoke an 11th number, 0. Jessup had not said 0. His recording clearly stops at 10. The transcription shows no ambiguity, but the echo included a number that the inspector never spoke, a number that, in the context of a countdown, suggested an ending that Jessup's original count had not reached. Hubbard's analysis notes reflect her confusion. I have listened to this cylinder over 40 times, she wrote. The reversed sequence cannot be explained by any acoustic phenomenon I am aware of. The additional utterance, 0, is not present in the original vocalization. I do not know where it came from. Hubbard attempted to contact Jessup to discuss the recording. She learned that he had died in 1931, 14 years after making the recording. His death certificate listed the cause as heart failure. He was 53 years old. His widow, reached by letter in 1944, provided additional context that Hubbard found troubling. Franklin never spoke about that recording, Mrs. Jessup wrote. He filed his inspection report and said nothing more about the bachelor mine. But in his final years, he developed a habit I could not understand. He would count backward from 10 out loud at odd moments, while washing dishes, while sitting in his chair, while lying in bed at night. He would reach 1 and then stop, as if waiting for something. I asked him once what he was doing. He said he was checking. He would not say what he was checking for. The bachelor mine closed in 1925, following a series of financial setbacks. The tunnels were not sealed. They simply fell into disuse as Creed's economy declined. In the decades since, the mine has been explored occasionally by historians and urban adventurers, though access is difficult and technically illegal. A geology professor from Fort Lewis College named Martin Okonkwo visited the bachelor in 1987 as part of a broader survey of abandoned San Juan mines. Okonkwo brought modern recording equipment, a portable cassette recorder, and attempted to replicate Jessup's experiment in the same location. His recordings captured echoes with unusually long delays consistent with the historical reports, but the echoes did not reverse. They did not add additional sounds. Okonkwo published a brief paper attributing the delays to complex interference patterns created by the tunnel geometry, though he acknowledged that his explanation did not fully account for the magnitude of the observed delays. Okonkwo's paper did not mention Jessup's original recording. When contacted by a journalist in 2004, Okonkwo admitted he had never heard it. I was not aware of the 1917 cylinder until after I published, he said. When I learned about it, I requested access from the School of Mines. They told me the recording was being preserved and was not available for analysis. I asked when it might become available. They did not answer. The Colorado School of Mines Library Catalog lists Jessup's wax cylinder as item MS-117-0614-BACH. The catalog entry includes a note added in 1972, playback restricted, transcription available upon request. Original cylinder shows unusual degradation pattern not consistent with normal aging. A librarian who worked in the archives during the 1990s, speaking anonymously to a podcast about Colorado mysteries in 2018, described the cylinder's condition. It's stored in a climate-controlled case, same as all the other wax recordings from that era, she said. But it doesn't look like the others. The surface has these grooves that seem too deep, like something pressed into the wax after the recording was made. I asked a preservation specialist about it once. He said the grooves looked like they were still forming, still getting deeper. He said it was probably just thermal expansion, but he wouldn't touch it again after that. The bachelor mine remains standing, its entrance a dark opening in the mountainside above Creed. Hikers who pass near the old workings occasionally report hearing sounds from inside, distant, rhythmic, impossible to identify. A Forest Service volunteer named Rebecca Sandoval mentioned in a 2012 interview that visitors sometimes asked about the counting. They say they hear someone counting, Sandoval said, coming from inside the mine. Counting backward, they say, always backward. Sandoval paused before adding a detail she seemed reluctant to share. One hiker told me he heard it reach 0. He said after 0, there was another number, a number after 0. I asked him what it was. He said he didn't know. He said it wasn't a word he recognized, but he heard it clearly. One more number after the counting should have stopped. The transcription of Franklin Jessup's recording remains available through the Colorado School of Mines archive. Researchers who request it receive a typed copy of Dorothy Hubbard's 1943 analysis, including her notation of the reversed echo and the unexplained 11th number. The final page of Hubbard's notes contains a question she never answered. If the echo counts backward from 10 to 0, what comes before 0? And if the mountain knows, why did it answer before Jessup asked? The Bachelor mine produced over $3 million in silver during its 34 years of operation. Its acoustic anomalies were never explained. Franklin Jessup conducted over 200 mine inspections during his career, and the Bachelor was the only one he never discussed. His recording remains in storage, its grooves allegedly still deepening, its echo still counting in a direction that sound should not be able to travel. And somewhere in those numbers, between 1 and 0, or perhaps after 0 entirely, the mountain added something that Franklin Jessup did not say, in a voice that was unmistakably his own. The clocks tried to warn them. No one knew how to listen. The Camp Bird mine occupies a hanging valley above Ouray, Colorado, accessible only by a narrow road that clings to canyon walls rising over 1,000 feet from the Uncompahgre River below. The scenery is spectacular: jagged peaks, cascading waterfalls, and alpine meadows that bloom briefly each summer before the snow returns. But the men who worked the Camp Bird in its early years had little time for scenery. They were too busy extracting gold from one of the richest ore bodies ever discovered in the American West. Thomas Walsh purchased the Camp Bird claim in 1896 after recognizing that previous owners had overlooked a vein of extraordinary value. Within 5 years, the mine made Walsh one of the wealthiest men in Colorado. He built an elaborate boarding house for his workers, complete with steam heat, electric lights, and a dining hall that served fresh vegetables even in winter. He installed modern equipment, hired experienced engineers, and maintained safety standards that exceeded industry norms. Walsh also installed clocks, 17 of them distributed throughout the mine's surface facilities and underground workings. The clocks served practical purposes, coordinating shift changes, timing blasting sequences, ensuring that the complex machinery of extraction operated in proper synchronization. Each clock was wound daily by a different worker, a rotation system designed to distribute the responsibility and ensure that no single timepiece was neglected. The clocks were mechanical, powered by springs and regulated by pendulums or balance wheels. They required no external power source. They kept time independently, each one a self-contained system with no connection to the others, which made their synchronized failure all the more difficult to explain. On February 8, 1902, a surface foreman named Isaac Marlowe noticed that the clock in his office had stopped. The time displayed was 2:14 in the afternoon. Marlowe checked his pocket watch. It read 2:14 and 23 seconds. As he reached to adjust the wall clock, it resumed ticking on its own, as if nothing had happened. Marlowe noted the incident in his daily log, but attached no particular significance to it. Clocks stopped occasionally. Springs lost tension. Dust accumulated in mechanisms. A brief pause followed by spontaneous resumption was unusual, but not unprecedented. The following day, February 9th, Marlowe's clock stopped again at 2:14. So did the clock in the assay office. So did the clock in the hoisting room. So did 3 clocks in the underground workings, according to miners who emerged at the end of their shift. 6 clocks, all stopping at the same moment, all resuming within seconds. Marlowe reported the phenomenon to the mine's superintendent, a methodical Scotsman named Angus McPherson. McPherson was skeptical but thorough. He assigned workers to monitor each of the mine's 17 clocks the following day, recording any anomalies. On February 10th, all 17 clocks stopped at 2:14. The monitors confirmed that the stoppages were simultaneous, as nearly as could be determined without synchronized timing instruments, and that each clock resumed within 5 to 8 seconds. The clocks displayed no mechanical malfunction. Their springs were properly tensioned, their movements were clean and well oiled. They simply stopped, held at 2:14, and then continued as if nothing had occurred. McPherson ordered the clocks examined by a jeweler brought up from Ouray. The jeweler, a German immigrant named Friedrich Brenner, spent 2 days inspecting each timepiece. His report, preserved in the Ouray County Historical Society's archives, concluded that the clocks were in excellent working order. "I find no defect in any mechanism," Brenner wrote. "The synchronized stoppage cannot be attributed to mechanical failure. I have no explanation to offer." The stoppages continued. February 11th, February 12th, February 13th. Every day at 2:14, all 17 clocks stopped. Every day they resumed after a brief pause. The duration of the pause varied slightly, sometimes 4 seconds, sometimes 9. But the stopping time never wavered. 2:14. Every clock, every day. Workers began to grow uneasy. A miner named Paolo Ferraro later described the atmosphere in a letter to his family in Italy. "The clocks are making the men nervous," Ferraro wrote on February 13th. "They say something is coming at 2:14. No one knows what. But the mountain is counting down to something, they say. And we are all waiting." Thomas Walsh was in Denver on business during most of this period, but McPherson's increasingly urgent telegrams brought him back to the mine on the evening of February 13th. Walsh listened to the reports with visible impatience. He was a practical man, a businessman, and he had little tolerance for superstition. According to McPherson's later account, Walsh ordered all 17 clocks removed from the property that night. Workers took them down from walls, unbolted them from posts, and carried them to a storage shed at the base of the access road, 3 miles from the mine entrance. Walsh wanted them gone before the morning shift arrived. The removal was completed by midnight. Walsh retired to his private quarters in the boarding house, satisfied that the matter had been resolved. At 6:15 the following morning, February 14, 1902, Walsh entered his office to review production reports. On his desk sat a clock. It was not one of the 17. McPherson confirmed this immediately upon being summoned. The clock was unfamiliar in design, older, heavier, with a brass casing that showed signs of significant age. Its face was marked with Roman numerals, and its hands were positioned at 2:14. The clock was ticking. Walsh demanded to know who had placed it there. No one claimed responsibility. No one had seen it arrive. The night watchman reported no visitors, no disturbances, no entry to Walsh's office between midnight and dawn. Walsh ordered the clock removed. A worker named Henrik Dahlberg carried it outside and placed it on a wagon. Before the wagon could depart, someone noticed that the clock's hands had moved. It was now displaying 2:13, 1 minute to 2:14. The cave-in occurred at 2:14 that afternoon. The collapse originated in the mine's third level, in a section that had been worked for over 2 years without incident. Geological surveys had identified no weaknesses. Timbering was sound. There had been no blasting that day, no vibrations that might have destabilized the surrounding rock. 7 men were killed instantly when the ceiling gave way. Their bodies were recovered over the following 3 days. The official investigation attributed the collapse to unforeseen geological conditions, a phrase that explained nothing but satisfied the legal requirements for closure. Paolo Ferraro was not among the dead. He had been assigned to a different level that morning, a last-minute change ordered by McPherson for reasons the superintendent later said he could not explain. "I simply felt he should not be there," McPherson wrote in his personal journal. "I had no reason. I had no evidence. But I moved him, and he lived. I moved 7 others as well. They lived too. I do not know why I chose those 8 men. I do not know why I did not choose more." The 18 clock, the one that had appeared on Walsh's desk, was never seen again after the collapse. Workers who had loaded it onto the wagon reported that it was gone when they returned that evening. The wagon had not moved. The clock had simply vanished. Walsh sold the Camp Bird mine in 1902, shortly after the disaster. He never returned to Ouray. The buyer, a British consortium, continued operations for another 14 years before declining ore grades forced closure. None of the subsequent owners reported any anomalies with clocks. A mining historian named Adelaide Schuster researched the incident in 1978, interviewing descendants of workers who had been present in February 1902. Several families preserved letters and journals that corroborated the clock stoppages, and Schuster compiled a detailed chronology of the 6 days leading up to the collapse. One detail emerged from her research that the official records had not preserved. According to 3 independent sources, the 7 men who died in the collapse had all been present in McPherson's office on February 13th, when Walsh ordered the clocks removed. All 7 had volunteered to help carry the clocks to the storage shed. All 7 had handled the timepieces directly. The 8 men whom McPherson reassigned, the ones who survived, had not been present at the removal. None of them had touched the clocks. Schuster included this correlation in her research notes, but omitted it from her published article, later explaining to a colleague that the implication was too uncomfortable to print. The Camp Bird Mine is now a popular destination for 4-wheel drive tours during the summer months. Visitors can see the remains of the boarding house, the rusted hoisting equipment, and the collapsed entrance to the 3rd level where 7 men died on February 14, 1902. A tour guide named Marcus Delgado, who has led excursions to the site since 2008, mentioned in a 2019 interview that guests occasionally report unusual experiences with their watches and phones. Digital stuff usually works fine, Delgado said, but mechanical watches, the old-fashioned kind with hands, sometimes they act strange up there. They stop for a few seconds and then start again. Not all of them, just some. And it's never at the same time twice. He paused. Except once. A few years ago, I had a group of 7 tourists, and all of their watches stopped at the same moment. They compared notes afterward, and every single one had stopped at 2:14. They thought it was a fun coincidence. I didn't tell them about the cave-in. I didn't tell them about the clocks. I just got them back to town as fast as I could. The 17 original clocks from the Camp Bird Mine were never recovered from the storage shed where Walsh ordered them placed. When the British consortium took over the property, the shed was empty. No record exists of their removal or their subsequent location. But a clockmaker in Montrose, Colorado, reported in 1934 that a customer had brought him an unusual timepiece for repair, a heavy brass clock with Roman numerals that the customer said he had found in an abandoned mine building near Auray. The clockmaker noted in his repair log that the clock's mechanism was frozen, its hands locked in position. The time displayed was 2:14. The customer never returned to collect it. The clockmaker kept the clock in his shop for 30 years before donating it to a local historical society. The society's records show that the clock was accepted into the collection in 1964. The current catalog lists it as missing, last documented 1978. The year Adelaide Schuster began her research. The Camp Bird Mine produced over $27 million in gold during its operational years. Its collapse on February 14, 1902, remains one of the deadliest single incidents in Ouray County's mining history. The official cause was geological instability. The unofficial cause, the one that miners whispered about for decades afterward, was simpler and more disturbing. The mountain had announced exactly when it intended to take what it was owed, and it had used the language of time itself to make the appointment. 7 men arrived at 2:14. The clocks had been telling them for 6 days not to come. The dead came back to work. Someone made sure no one would remember when. Leadville, Colorado, sits at an elevation of 10,152 feet, making it the highest incorporated city in the United States. In the 1880s, it was also one of the wealthiest, a boomtown built on silver, where fortunes were made and lost in the span of weeks, and the population swelled to over 40,000. The streets were lined with opera houses, hotels, and saloons. Oscar Wilde lectured there. gambling halls operated around the clock, and beneath it all, thousands of men descended into the earth each day to extract the ore that made the excess possible. The Matchless Mine was among Leadville's most famous operations, owned for a time by Horace Tabor, the Silver King, whose rags-to-riches story became Colorado legend. Tabor bought the Matchless in 1879 and extracted millions in silver before the crash of 1893 destroyed his empire. The mine changed hands repeatedly in the decades that followed, operated by a succession of smaller companies until it finally closed in the early 20th century. Throughout its operational years, the Matchless maintained detailed personnel records. Payroll ledgers, shift assignments, accident reports, and death registers were kept in leather-bound volumes stored in the mine's administrative office. When the mine closed, these records were transferred to the Lake County Courthouse, where they remained largely untouched for decades. A graduate student named Richard Olmsted first examined the Matchless records in 1963 while researching labor conditions in Colorado's silver mines. Olmsted was interested in mortality rates, how many men died underground, under what circumstances, and how the companies responded. The Matchless death register seemed like an ideal primary source. What he found instead was a mystery he spent the rest of his career trying to solve. The death register covered the years 1879 to 1908, recording the names of workers who died in the mine, along with dates, causes of death, and next-of-kin information. The entries were handwritten in various hands, reflecting the turnover of clerks and administrators over the 29-year period. The binding was intact. The pages were numbered sequentially, but 7 pages were missing. The gaps were not obvious at first glance. The page numbers skipped from 47 to 49, from 82 to 84, from 115 to 117. But the binding showed no signs of damage. Olmsted examined the spine closely and found what he later described as surgical evidence. The pages had been cut out with a razor or very sharp knife, the incisions made so close to the binding that only careful inspection revealed their absence. Someone had removed 7 pages from the death register with extraordinary precision, leaving no visible trace of their excision. Olmsted attempted to reconstruct the missing entries by cross-referencing other sources, newspaper obituaries, cemetery records, church burial logs, and county death certificates. This research allowed him to identify the approximate dates covered by each missing page, and in some cases, the names of workers who had likely died during those periods. But the cross-referencing revealed something stranger than missing records. The pages immediately preceding and following the gaps contained anomalies that Olmsted could not explain. On page 46, the page before the first gap, the register recorded the death of a mucker named Cornelius Brandt on September 12, 1883. The cause was listed as crushing injury, cave-in. The entry appeared complete and unremarkable. On page 49, the page after the gap, the register contained routine shift assignments for September 15, 1883. Among the names listed for the morning shift was Cornelius Brandt. Olmsted initially assumed this was a clerical error, perhaps a different worker with the same name. But the Matchless payroll records showed only one Cornelius Brandt employed during that period. The cemetery records showed Cornelius Brandt buried on September 13, 1883. The church register confirmed his funeral mass on the same date. Cornelius Brandt had died on September 12th. He had been buried on September 13th. And according to the mine's own shift log, he had reported for work on September 15th. The pattern repeated at each of the 7 gaps. Before the second gap, the register recorded the death of a timberman named Michael Sweeney on April 7, 1886, blasting accident. After the gap, Sweeney's name appeared on the shift roster for April 10th. Cemetery records confirmed his burial on April 8th. Before the third gap, a driller named Joseph Kowalczyk died on November 19, 1889, equipment failure. After the gap, Kowalczyk appeared on the work assignment for November 22nd. His grave marker in Leadville's Evergreen Cemetery listed his death as November 19th. 7 gaps, 7 deaths. 7 instances of dead men returning to work 2 or 3 days after their documented burials. Olmsted shared his findings with his thesis advisor, a historian named Margaret Ainsworth. Her response, preserved in Olmsted's personal papers at the University of Denver, reflected deep skepticism. The most likely explanation is systematic clerical error, Ainsworth wrote. Mine records from this era were often maintained by undertrained personnel working in difficult conditions. Duplicate names, misstated entries, and transcription mistakes were common. I would caution against reading too much into what are probably mundane administrative failures. Olmsted accepted this guidance and completed his thesis without mentioning the ledger gaps. But he continued researching the matchless records privately for the next 3 decades, compiling evidence that increasingly contradicted his advisor's dismissal. In 1978, Olmsted located payroll vouchers corresponding to the 7 anomalous post-death work assignments. In each case, a voucher had been issued for the deceased worker's shift. In each case, the voucher had been signed. The signatures matched samples from when the workers were alive. Olmsted consulted a forensic document examiner named Pauline Garrett in 1981. Garrett compared the post-death signatures to authenticated samples from each worker's personnel file, hiring documents, previous payroll acknowledgments, and company store credit applications. The signatures are consistent, Garrett reported. Same hand, same pressure patterns, same characteristic flourishes. If these are forgeries, they are exceptionally skilled ones. But I find no evidence of forgery. The signatures appear to be genuine. Olmsted asked the obvious question: how could a dead man sign a payroll voucher? Garrett had no answer. A journalist named Sandra Reeves attempted to investigate the ledger gaps in 1994 after reading a brief reference to Olmsted's research in a regional history journal. Reeves requested access to the matchless records at the Lake County Courthouse and was informed that the death register had been transferred for preservation to an unspecified facility in Denver. Reeves contacted the Colorado State Archives, the Denver Public Library, and the Colorado Historical Society. None had any record of receiving the matchless death register. The Lake County Courthouse could not identify who had authorized the transfer or when it had occurred. The register has not been located since. Olmsted died in 2002, leaving behind 40 years of research notes that his family donated to the University of Denver's special collections. The notes include photocopies of several pages from the death register, made during Olmsted's initial 1963 examination. The copies show the gaps clearly, page numbers jumping, content discontinuous, but they do not include the pages that were removed. Whatever was recorded on those 7 pages remains unknown. A local historian named Francis Delacroix reviewed Olmsted's papers in 2014 and made one additional discovery that Olmsted himself had apparently overlooked. Among the photocopied pages was a partial image of page 114, the page immediately before the 5th gap. The copy was poorly aligned, capturing not just the intended page, but a sliver of the facing page as well. The facing page would have been page 115, the first of 2 missing pages in that section. The sliver showed only a fragment of text, the end of a sentence that read, "returned without explanation and resumed duties as though no interruption had." The sentence continued on to the removed portion. Its beginning, its context, and its subject were lost with the missing page. Delacroix published a brief article about the ledger gaps in a regional history quarterly, but her work attracted little attention. The matchless mine is now a tourist attraction, preserved as a monument to Leadville's silver era. Visitors can tour the head frame, view antique equipment, and hear stories about Horace Tabor and his second wife, Baby Doe, who famously lived in poverty at the mine site for decades after the family fortune evaporated. Tour guides do not mention the death register. They do not discuss the 7 gaps or the workers who apparently returned from their graves. When asked about the mine safety record, they provide general statistics about 19th century mining casualties. But occasionally, according to a former guide named Terrence Wakefield, visitors ask questions that the standard tour does not address. Sometimes people want to know about specific miners, Wakefield said in a 2017 interview. They've done genealogy research, or they're looking for ancestors who worked in Leadville. I help when I can, but there are some names I've learned not to look up. Wakefield paused. 7 names, specifically. When people ask about those 7 men, I tell them the records are incomplete. I don't tell them why. I don't tell them what the records actually show, because what they show doesn't make sense, and I've learned that some questions are better left without answers. The names of the 7 workers whose deaths preceded the ledger gaps are documented in Olmsted's research notes. Their graves are marked in Leadville cemeteries. Their death certificates are filed with Lake County. By every official measure, they died on the dates recorded and were buried within days. But somewhere in a register that no one can find, on pages that someone carefully removed, there may be an explanation for why the Matchless Mine continued to pay them and why they continued to sign for their wages after the earth had already claimed them. The Matchless Mine produced over $11 million in silver during its peak years. Its death register documented the loss of dozens of workers to the ordinary hazards of underground mining. But 7 entries were considered dangerous enough to cut from the record entirely, leaving behind only the evidence of their removal and the impossible clerical trail of men who came back to work after their own funerals. Richard Olmsted spent 40 years trying to understand what those pages contained. He died without finding the register, without reading the missing entries, and without answering the question that haunted his research. If the dead men returned, who or what came back in their place? They breathe together. They have been breathing together for longer than anyone can remember. The Molly Kathleen Mine descends into the granite slopes of Battle Mountain, 1 mile north of Cripple Creek, Colorado. Unlike most historic mines in the region, the Molly Kathleen was never abandoned, never sealed, never left to flood and collapse. Instead, it was converted into a tourist attraction in 1938, offering visitors the rare opportunity to descend 1,000 feet into the earth in an original mining cage and walk through tunnels that once produced gold worth millions. The mine opened in 1891 after a rancher named Molly Kathleen Gortner discovered gold float on the mountainside while searching for stray cattle. Her claim became one of the most productive in the Cripple Creek district, and the mine operated commercially until 1961. For over 2 decades since its conversion to a tourist operation, the Molly Kathleen has welcomed hundreds of thousands of visitors into its depths. Most of them see nothing unusual. They ride the cage down, listen to the guide's presentation, examine ore samples and antique equipment, and return to the surface with photographs and stories about the darkness underground. But some visitors report something else. The tour guide logs at the Molly Kathleen are not public documents. They are internal records maintained by the mine's management, used primarily to track visitor counts, equipment issues, and safety incidents. But former employees who have reviewed these logs describe a recurring entry that appears with unusual frequency. Group reported coordinated breathing on level 10. The first documented instance dates to 1954, 16 years after the mine opened for tours. A guide named Robert Trujillo noted that a group of 12 visitors had reported hearing rhythmic breathing sounds in the main drift of the 1,000-foot level. Trujillo investigated but found no source for the sound. He attributed it to air circulation through the ventilation system and noted that the visitors seemed unsettled but unharmed. Similar reports accumulated over the following decades. 1958. 12 visitors, breathing sounds reported, no source identified. 1963. Group of 12 described synchronized respiration, audible in level 10 drift. 1971. Coordinated breathing phenomenon, 12 visitors, third occurrence this month. A pattern emerged that guides eventually recognized but rarely discussed with outsiders. The breathing was only heard when tour groups numbered exactly 12. Groups of 11 reported nothing. Groups of 13 reported nothing. Groups of 8, 15, 22 all descended to the 1,000-foot level and returned without incident. But when exactly 12 visitors rode the cage down, the breathing began. A former guide named Esther Moreno, who worked at the Molly Kathleen from 1974 to 1989, described the phenomenon in an interview conducted by a folklore researcher in 2003. "You'd know before you even reached the bottom," Moreno said. "You'd count heads in the cage, and if there were 12, you'd think, okay, here we go." And sure enough, about 2 minutes into the walking tour, someone would stop and say, "Do you hear that?" And then everyone would hear it. Breathing, deep, slow breathing, like a room full of people all inhaling and exhaling at the exact same time. Moreno estimated that she personally witnessed the phenomenon over 50 times during her 15-year tenure. She developed techniques for managing the situation, keeping visitors moving, speaking loudly to mask the sound, redirecting attention to geological features. But the breathing always continued until the group returned to the cage. "It wasn't scary exactly," Moreno said. "It was more like being watched, like the mountain was aware of us, like it was breathing with us, or waiting for us to breathe with it." The phenomenon's most unusual characteristic was its resistance to documentation. Multiple visitors over the years attempted to record the breathing with cameras, tape recorders, and later smartphones. In every documented case, the recording captured nothing. The breathing stopped the moment a recording device was activated, resuming only after the device was turned off. A visitor named Martin Schaefer, an audio engineer from Denver, visited the Molly Kathleen in 1992 specifically to investigate the phenomenon. Schaefer had heard about the breathing from a colleague whose family had experienced it, and he brought professional recording equipment capable of capturing sounds below the threshold of human hearing. Schaefer's account, published in a small circulation paranormal research journal in 1994, described his experience in technical detail. "The group numbered exactly 12. I had arranged this deliberately," Schaefer wrote. "Approximately 90 seconds into the walking tour, I began to perceive a rhythmic, low-frequency oscillation consistent with synchronized respiration. The sound was clearly audible to all members of the group. I activated my recording equipment. The breathing stopped. Schaefer kept his equipment running for the remainder of the tour. The breathing did not resume. When the group returned to the surface, Schaefer reviewed his recordings and found only ambient mine noise, ventilation, water dripping, the distant hum of machinery, no breathing, no oscillation, nothing. He returned the following week with a different group of 12. The breathing began again. He activated his recorder. The breathing stopped. I repeated this experiment 4 times over 2 months, Schaefer wrote. The result was identical in every instance. The phenomenon appears to be selectively imperceptible to recording technology. I have no explanation for this. Former miners who worked the 1,000-foot level during the Molly Kathleen's commercial years have been reluctant to discuss their experiences. Most are now deceased, but a historian named Patricia Woodward managed to interview 3 surviving miners in 1997 as part of an oral history project on Cripple Creek's gold mining era. All 3 refused to speak about the breathing directly, but each acknowledged independently that workers on the 1,000-foot level had a name for it: the congregation. A driller named Hector Villanueva, 84 years old at the time of his interview, provided the only detailed comment. "We didn't talk about it," Villanueva said. "You don't talk about things like that, not underground. But we knew. You never worked that level with a crew of 12. Never. The foreman made sure of it. 11 was fine. 13 was fine. But 12? We had a rule. You break your crew before you let it number 12. Woodward asked why 12 was significant. Villanueva shook his head. "Because that's how many there were," he said. "That's how many are still down there. And they're waiting for the number to match. They're waiting to be complete." He refused to elaborate. He died in 2001, and whatever he knew about the congregation's origins died with him. The Molly Kathleen continues to operate as a tourist attraction, though ownership has changed hands several times since its 1938 conversion. Current management declines to comment on the breathing phenomenon, and guides are reportedly instructed not to discuss it with visitors. But the tour logs continue to accumulate entries. A former employee who left the Molly Kathleen in 2016, speaking anonymously to a podcast about Colorado mysteries, estimated that the phenomenon had been reported over 270 times since record-keeping began. The frequency has remained remarkably consistent, approximately 8 to 12 reports per year, every year, for over 6 decades. "The weirdest part isn't the breathing itself," the employee said. "It's how normal it's become. The guides know about it, management knows about it. Everyone who works there for more than a few months experiences it eventually, and nobody talks about it. Because what is there to say? The mountain breathes when 12 people go down. It's been doing it for 80 years. It'll probably keep doing it forever." The employee mentioned one additional detail that does not appear in any official log. "There's a retired guide, I won't say her name, who kept her own count, not of how many times she heard the breathing, but of how many breaths she counted when it happened. She said it was always the same, always exactly 12 breaths, 12 slow inhales, 12 slow exhales, and then silence until someone tried to record it or the group got back in the cage." The employee paused. "She said she tried counting along once, breathing with it, matching the rhythm. She got to 11 and couldn't make herself take the 12th breath. She said her body just refused. Like something was already using that breath. Like the 12th slot was already taken." The 1,000-foot level of the Molly Kathleen mine remains open to visitors. Tours depart every half hour during peak season. The cage holds a maximum of 15 passengers, though groups often number fewer. Guides do not count heads publicly before descent. They do not acknowledge the phenomenon if visitors report it. They simply continue the tour, speaking about ore grades and extraction methods and the history of Cripple Creek's gold rush, while somewhere in the darkness beyond their lanterns, the congregation waits for its number to be complete and breathes. The Molly Kathleen mine produced over $4 million in gold during its commercial years. It has welcomed over 1 million tourists since 1938. The breathing on the 1,000-foot level has never been explained, never been recorded, and never been absent when 12 people descend together. Hector Villanueva said they were waiting to be complete. He did not say what would happen when the number finally matched, when a 12th breath was taken, when the congregation was whole, when the mountain finally had what it had been waiting for since the tunnels first opened into its heart. The tunnel was getting longer. The mountain was making room for something. The Stanley Mine sits in the steep terrain above Idaho Springs, Colorado, approximately 40 miles west of Denver, along the course of Clear Creek. The canyon that holds the town is narrow and deep, carved by millennia of snowmelt rushing toward the plains. Mining began here in 1859, part of the first wave of the Colorado Gold Rush, and continued for over a century. The Stanley was a mid-sized operation, never as famous as some of its neighbors, but productive enough to employ dozens of men and maintain continuous operations from 1881 to 1934. The mine's lower workings extended over 1,000 feet into the mountainside, following a vein of gold-bearing quartz that angled downward at approximately 15 degrees. The deepest section was known simply as the Lower Drift, a horizontal tunnel running east to west at the 700-foot level. It was cold there and dark, and far enough from the main shaft that workers sometimes felt they had entered a different world entirely. The Lower Drift had a reputation. Miners who worked the section reported experiences that were difficult to articulate and impossible to verify. They spoke of distances that didn't add up, of walking for 30 minutes in one direction and finding themselves back where they started, of tunnels that seemed shorter in the morning than they had been the night before, of equipment left at the drift's far end, appearing near the entrance without explanation. A mucker named James Whitaker described his experience in a letter to his wife in March 1922. "There is something wrong with the Lower Drift," Whitaker wrote. "I cannot say what it is. The distances change. Yesterday I walked the full length in 12 minutes. Today the same walk took 25. I counted my steps both times. Yesterday was 480 steps. Today was over 900. I am not imagining this. The other men have noticed too. We do not speak of it, but we have noticed." Whitaker requested a transfer to a different section of the mine the following month. His request was granted. His replacement lasted 6 weeks before making a similar request. By late 1922, the Stanleys' management could no longer ignore the complaints. Production in the Lower Drift had declined significantly, not because the ore was exhausted, but because workers refused to spend extended periods there. Shift times grew erratic. Men emerged from the drift confused about how long they had been underground. Equipment costs increased as tools were lost or misplaced in a tunnel that seemed, according to multiple reports, to rearrange itself between shifts. In January 1923, the mine's owners contracted a professional surveyor named Edmund Fairchild to map the Lower Drift and resolve the discrepancies. Fairchild was well qualified for the assignment. He had surveyed mines throughout Colorado and New Mexico for over 15 years, working with the precision instruments and mathematical methods required to chart underground spaces where compass readings were unreliable and visibility was limited to the reach of a carbide lamp. His reputation was built on accuracy. His reports were used for legal filings, engineering assessments, and insurance evaluations. He arrived at the Stanley on January 15, 1923, and descended to the Lower Drift the following morning. His first day's measurements established a baseline. Using a transit theodolite and calibrated chains, Fairchild determined that the Lower Drift extended 1,240 feet from its junction, with the main access tunnel to the working face at its far end. The figure was consistent with the mine's original engineering drawings, which showed the drift at approximately 1,200 feet. Fairchild noted the measurement in his field book and proceeded to survey the drift's side passages and geological features. He completed his work by early afternoon and ascended to the surface, satisfied that the project would require only a few more days. He returned the following morning to verify his baseline measurement before beginning detailed mapping. The drift now measured 1,340 feet. Fairchild recalibrated his instruments. He checked his chains for stretching or damage. He repeated the measurement 3 times, working with obsessive care to eliminate any possibility of error. The result was the same. The Lower Drift was exactly 100 feet longer than it had been the previous day. Fairchild documented his findings in a report submitted to the mine's ownership on January 25th. His field notes from the intervening week, preserved in the Clear Creek County Historical Society's collection, show measurements taken daily from January 17th through January 24th. January 17th, 1,340 feet. January 18th, 1,440 feet. January 19th, 1,540 feet. January 20th, 1,640 feet. January 21st, 1,740 feet. January 22nd, 1,840 feet. January 23rd, 1,940 feet. January 24th, 2,040 feet. The drift was growing by exactly 100 feet per day. The growth rate never varied. The increments never changed. Fairchild measured the same tunnel 8 times, and each time it was precisely 100 feet longer than the measurement before. His report to the ownership group, a copy of which survives in the Colorado School of Mines archive, reflects a professional struggling to maintain composure in the face of impossible data. "I have surveyed underground workings for 15 years," Fairchild wrote. "I have never encountered a phenomenon I could not explain through geological, mechanical, or human factors. The elongation of the Stanley Lower Drift cannot be explained through any of these factors. The measurements are accurate. The instruments are functioning properly. The tunnel is lengthening at a constant rate, and I do not know why." Fairchild recommended that the survey be continued to determine whether the growth would eventually stop. The ownership group agreed, and Fairchild returned to the lower drift on January 25th. His measurements that day showed the drift at 2,140 feet, 100 feet longer than the previous day, exactly as expected. But Fairchild also noted a new development. The tunnel's working face, the solid rock wall at the drift's far end, had not moved. The drift was not extending into new territory. Instead, the existing tunnel was somehow stretching, the space between its entrance and its terminus expanding without any physical change to the rock itself. Fairchild attempted to document this by placing markers at measured intervals along the drift's length. He drove iron spikes into the tunnel walls at 100-foot intervals, creating reference points that would reveal whether the expansion was uniform or concentrated in particular sections. The following day, his markers had moved. The spikes remained embedded in the rock exactly where he had placed them, but the distances between them had changed. The first interval, which had measured exactly 100 feet on January 25th, now measured 108 feet. The second interval had expanded to 112 feet, the third to 109. The expansion was distributed unevenly throughout the tunnel, as if the rock itself was breathing, stretching in some places, remaining static in others. Fairchild abandoned the survey on January 28th. His final report, delivered to the mine's ownership on February 1, 1923, has never been made fully public. A summary prepared by the company's attorney in 1934, following the mine's closure, describes Fairchild's conclusions in careful language. Mr. Fairchild's survey of the lower drift was terminated due to the impossibility of obtaining reliable measurements. The drift's length at the time of survey abandonment is listed as undetermined, equipment insufficient. Mr. Fairchild has recommended that the lower drift be permanently sealed and that no further survey work be attempted. The owners followed this recommendation. The lower drift was sealed with timber and rubble in March 1923. Workers were reassigned to other sections of the mine. Production continued in the upper levels until 1934, when declining ore grades and economic pressures forced the Stanley's closure. Edmund Fairchild never spoke publicly about his experience in the lower drift. He continued working as a surveyor until his retirement in 1941. But colleagues noted that he refused assignments involving deep underground work after 1923. A nephew who handled Fairchild's estate after his death in 1958 reported finding his surveying instruments in perfect condition, stored in their original cases. The transit theodolite's lens had been removed and was never located. The Stanley Mine's entrance collapsed in 1967, a consequence of decades of neglect and the slow pressure of the mountain settling into its abandoned cavities. The lower drift is now inaccessible, buried beneath tons of rock and debris. But a geologist named Miriam Soto conducted ground-penetrating radar surveys of the Stanley site in 2011 as part of a regional study of historic mine stability. Her equipment detected the expected voids, collapsed tunnels, flooded chambers, and the remnants of ore extraction. She also detected something unexpected. At the 700-foot level, approximately where the lower drift should have terminated, Soto's radar indicated a void space extending beyond the mine's documented boundaries. The anomaly continued eastward into terrain that had never been mined for an undetermined distance. The signal degraded before I could establish a terminus, Soto wrote in her survey notes. The void appears to continue beyond the effective range of my equipment. Based on signal strength at the limits of detection, I estimate the space extends at least another 3,000 feet beyond the mine's mapped boundaries, possibly farther. Soto's notes include a calculation that appears almost as an afterthought, scribbled in the margin beside her measurements. If the drift continued growing at 100 feet per day after the survey was abandoned in 1923, it would now extend approximately 3,300,000 feet. That is over 600 miles. She added a single word beneath the calculation, unlikely. But she did not cross it out. The Stanley Mine remains sealed, the lower drift remains buried, and somewhere beneath the mountains west of Idaho Springs, a tunnel that grew by exactly 100 feet each day may still be growing, stretching eastward through rock that should be solid, making room for something that has not yet arrived. The Stanley Mine produced over $2 million in gold during its 53 years of operation. Its lower drift was sealed in 1923 after a surveyor documented the impossible. A tunnel that grew longer every day by exactly the same amount, without any physical excavation. Edmund Fairchild's final measurement was 2,040 feet. His final assessment was that his equipment was insufficient. He did not say what equipment would be sufficient. He did not say what the drift was becoming. He simply stopped measuring and walked away, leaving behind a tunnel that may still be stretching into darkness 100 feet at a time, waiting to reach whatever destination it was always meant to find. They knew it was coming. They welcomed it. No one has ever explained why. The Vindicator mine operated on the southwestern slope of Battle Mountain, less than a mile from the more famous Independence mine in the Cripple Creek district. It opened in 1893 and quickly proved itself one of the most productive operations in the region, employing hundreds of workers and extracting ore valued at over $20 million during its operational lifetime. The mine's name was meant to evoke vindication, proof that the speculators who had invested in Cripple Creek's gold fields had been right to believe. On the morning of November 21, 1904, vindication became tragedy. A blasting cap detonated prematurely in the Vindicator's 6th level, triggering an explosion that collapsed over 200 feet of tunnel and killed 14 miners instantly. The disaster made national headlines, not only for its death toll, but for its timing. It occurred just 2 weeks after the assassination of a local mine superintendent in the ongoing labor wars that had torn the Cripple Creek district apart. Some suspected sabotage. Others blamed negligence. The official investigation concluded that the explosion was accidental, caused by a defective blasting cap that had been improperly stored. The 14 dead were buried in cemeteries across Teller County. Their widows received modest compensation from the mining company. The tunnels were reinforced, operations resumed, and the Vindicator continued producing gold for another decade. By the standards of the era, the disaster was unremarkable, another cost of doing business in an industry where death was always one mishandled charge away. But the letters remained. The first to notice them was a postal clerk named Horace Pemberton, who worked the early morning shift at the Cripple Creek post office. On November 21, 1904, Pemberton processed 14 letters that had been dropped through the mail slot before dawn. All 14 bore the same postmark time, 5:47 in the morning. All 14 were addressed to residences in Cripple Creek, Victor, and the surrounding mining camps. The explosion occurred at 7:15. Pemberton thought nothing of the letters at the time, but 2 days later, when the names of the dead were published in the Cripple Creek Times, he noticed something that disturbed him deeply. Every one of the 14 letters had been sent by a man who died in the explosion. Every one was addressed to that man's wife, mother, or nearest relative. The 14 miners had mailed letters to their families approximately 90 minutes before they were killed. Pemberton mentioned this coincidence to his supervisor, who mentioned it to a reporter, who mentioned it to the county coroner. Within a week, investigators had collected all 14 letters from their recipients and examined them as potential evidence in the ongoing inquiry into the explosion's cause. The contents of the letters made the investigation considerably more complicated. Each letter was brief, between 50 and 75 words, and written in the sender's own hand. Handwriting analysis confirmed that no 2 letters were written by the same person. The stationery varied. Some used company-issued paper from the Vindicator's supply office. Others used personal letterhead, and still others were written on plain foolscap purchased from local merchants. But every letter contained the same phrase, positioned identically in the final sentence, "The waiting is over." A miner named Tobias Hartman had written to his wife in Victor, "My dearest Annalise, I write to you this morning with peace in my heart. Tell the children I love them. Do not mourn too long. The waiting is over." A driller named Santiago Medina had written to his mother in Trinidad, "Mama, I am sorry I did not visit last month. Please forgive me. Light a candle for me at Mass. The waiting is over." A mucker named Olaf Bergstrom had written to his sister in Denver, "Ingrid, thank you for the socks you sent. They were warm. Take care of Father. The waiting is over." 14 letters, 14 different hands, 14 variations in tone, subject, and length, but the same 4 words appearing in the same position, expressing the same sentiment of conclusion. The coroner, a physician named Walter Hensley, interviewed the recipients of each letter. His notes, preserved in the Teller County archives, document his growing unease as the interviews progressed. Annalise Hartman reported that her husband had been in good spirits the previous evening. He had eaten dinner, played with his children, and retired early without complaint. He had not mentioned any concerns about work or health. Elena Medina reported that her son had written to her regularly for years and had never used any phrase resembling "the waiting is over." His letters were typically brief, practical, and focused on daily matters. The final letter was unlike anything he had sent before. Ingrid Bergstrom reported that her brother had not been particularly religious or philosophical. He was a quiet man who kept to himself. She had no idea what waiting he might have been referring to. None of the 14 families could explain the phrase. None had received any prior indication that their loved ones were expecting to die. None had observed unusual behavior in the days or weeks preceding the explosion. Hensley expanded his investigation to include the miners' co-workers and supervisors. He interviewed over 40 people who had worked alongside the 14 dead in the days before November 21st. No one reported anything unusual. The 14 men had worked different shifts in different sections of the mine. Some had known each other casually, most had not. They ranged in age from 19 to 53. They came from 8 different countries. They attended 4 different churches. There was no social connection, no shared organization, no common background that might explain the identical phrase in their letters. A foreman named Cecil Adkins, who supervised 3 of the dead, provided testimony that Hensley found particularly troubling. "They were good workers," Adkins said, "reliable, showed up on time, did their jobs, went home. Nothing strange about any of them. But now that you mention it, they all asked the same question last week. Different days, different shifts, but the same question. They wanted to know what time the morning blast was scheduled for November 21st. Hensley asked if that question was unusual. "Not by itself," Adkins replied. Men ask about blast schedules all the time. They want to know when to clear out. But these three asked specifically about the 21st, and they asked days in advance. Usually you ask the day of, not the week before. Further investigation revealed that all 14 miners had made similar inquiries. They had asked different supervisors on different days, but the question was the same. What time was the blast scheduled for November 21st? Some had asked as early as November 15th, 6 days before the explosion. None of them had been assigned to the blasting crew. None of them had any professional reason to know the schedule. And yet all 14 had made a point of learning the precise time when they would die. The investigation stalled. Hensley's final report, submitted in January 1905, concluded that the explosion was accidental and that the letters, while unexplained and troubling, did not constitute evidence of foul play. The phrase, "the waiting is over," was characterized as a coincidence of language that this office is unable to interpret. The report was filed and forgotten, but the letters themselves were not destroyed. They remained in the coroner's files, transferred eventually to the Teller County Archives, where they sat undisturbed for nearly 8 decades. A historian named Douglas Nakamura rediscovered them in 1987 while researching labor conditions in the Cripple Creek district. Nakamura was initially interested in the explosion itself, its causes, its aftermath, its role in the broader context of mining labor disputes. The letters were a secondary concern. They became his primary focus within weeks. Nakamura obtained permission to examine the original documents and spent 3 months analyzing their contents, handwriting, and paper composition. His findings, published in a regional history journal in 1990, added new details to the mystery, but resolved nothing. The paper used in 11 of the 14 letters had been manufactured by the same mill in Pennsylvania, but this was not unusual. The mill supplied paper to merchants throughout Colorado. The ink in 8 letters was consistent with a single batch produced by a Chicago company in 1903. But again, this proved only that the miners had purchased supplies from local stores that stocked common brands. More interesting was Nakamura's linguistic analysis. The phrase, "the waiting is over," was not common in correspondence of the era. Nakamura searched archived letters, diaries, and newspapers from Cripple Creek and surrounding communities, looking for similar usage. He found 3 instances in documents predating the explosion, all 3 in obituaries, describing the deceased's release from illness or suffering. The phrase carried connotations of death, Nakamura wrote. It was language used to describe the end of life, not the end of a workday or a difficult period. The 14 miners used it in a context that suggests they understood its meaning. They were announcing their own deaths. Nakamura attempted to determine whether the miners might have belonged to a secret society, a religious sect, or some other organization that could explain the coordinated letters. He found no evidence of any such affiliation. The 14 men were Catholic, Protestant, and non-religious. They were members of different unions, or no union at all. They lived in different boarding houses, drank in different saloons, and worshipped in different churches. The only thing they shared was their death, and the 4 words they used to announce it. The Vindicator mine closed in 1919, one of many Cripple Creek operations that succumbed to declining gold prices and rising costs. The surface works were dismantled, the tunnels allowed to flood. Today the site is marked only by scattered debris and a few stone foundations, barely visible among the sagebrush. A memorial to the 14 miners stands in the Mount Pisgah Cemetery outside Cripple Creek. The stone lists their names, their ages, and the date of the explosion. It does not mention the letters, but the letters remain in the Teller County Archives, available to researchers who request access. The paper has yellowed, the ink has faded. The handwriting of 14 dead men still forms the same 4 words, positioned in the same place, expressing the same impossible certainty about something that had not yet occurred. A note in the archival file, added by an unknown hand sometime after 1990, poses a question that Douglas Nakamura never answered. If they knew the waiting was over, what had they been waiting for? The Vindicator mine produced over $20 million in gold during its 26 years of operation. Its 1904 explosion killed 14 men whose bodies were recovered, identified, and buried according to the customs of the time. But the letters they sent, the letters that arrived after they were already dead, suggest that something in the Vindicator had been waiting far longer than the mine had existed. 14 men learned its schedule. 14 men made peace with their families. And 14 men descended into the mountain at precisely the appointed hour, ready at last for whatever had been waiting to receive them. They were not forbidden from speaking. They were forbidden from being heard. The Summitville mine sits high in the San Juan Mountains of southwestern Colorado, at an elevation exceeding 11,000 feet. The site is remote even by Colorado standards, accessible only by unpaved roads that become impassable for much of the year, surrounded by peaks that hold snow well into summer. The views are spectacular. The silence is absolute. On a windless day, the only sound is your own breathing. Mining at Summitville began in the 1870s, part of the silver rush that transformed the San Juan region. The original operations were small-scale affairs, worked by independent prospectors and short-lived companies that came and went with the fluctuations of metal prices. By the early 20th century, most of the easily accessible ore had been extracted, and Summitville entered a long period of dormancy. The site was revived in 1984 when a Canadian company called Galactic Resources acquired the mineral rights and began large-scale open-pit gold mining using a controversial technique called heap leaching. The operation lasted less than a decade. By 1992, Galactic Resources had declared bankruptcy, abandoning the site and leaving behind millions of gallons of cyanide-contaminated water that eventually leaked into the Alamosa River, poisoning 17 miles of waterway and killing all aquatic life. The Summitville disaster became a landmark environmental case, studied in universities and cited in regulatory debates. The cleanup cost exceeded $150 million. The site remains contaminated today. But the modern catastrophe obscured an older story, one that the miners who worked Summitville's underground levels in the 1980s carried with them when they left. A labor historian named Catherine Orozco began collecting oral histories from former Summitville workers in 1992, shortly after the site's abandonment. Her initial focus was on working conditions and the company's environmental practices, but the interviews kept returning to a subject that had nothing to do with cyanide or heap leaching. The silence protocol. A former heavy equipment operator named Dennis Yazzie was the first to mention it. Yazzie had worked at Summitville from 1985 to 1988, primarily on the surface operations. But he had occasionally been assigned to the underground workings, older tunnels from the 19th century that the company had reopened to access deeper ore deposits. Below 400 feet you didn't talk, Yazzie told Orozco. That was the rule. Hand signals only. If you needed to communicate something complicated, you wrote it down. The foreman carried notebooks and pencils. We all did. Orozco asked why the rule existed. Yazzie hesitated before answering. They told us it was for safety, something about sound vibrations and unstable rock. But that didn't make sense. We ran drilling equipment down there, jackhammers, pneumatic drills. Those are loud as hell. If sound was the problem, we'd have brought the whole mountain down. It wasn't the machines they were worried about. It was voices, human voices specifically. Other interviews corroborated Yazzie's account. A geologist named Maria Sundberg, who had conducted surveys in the lower levels, described the protocol in similar terms. The company was very clear about it, Sundberg said. No verbal communication below 400 feet. They said it was standard practice for that type of formation, but I'd worked mines all over the West, and I'd never heard of anything like it. I asked my supervisor once, a man named Brennan, why the rule existed. He just looked at me and said, "Because we don't want to find out what happens if we break it." Sundberg mentioned that the silence protocol appeared in no written documentation she could find. It was communicated verbally during orientation, reinforced by supervisors, and universally observed. But the company's official safety manual contained no reference to it. It was like a secret rule, she said. Everyone knew it, everyone followed it, but it didn't exist on paper. The most detailed account came from a former shift supervisor named Franklin Ware, who had overseen underground operations from 1986 to 1990. Ware initially declined to participate in Orozco's project, citing concerns about legal liability related to the environmental disaster. But after the statute of limitations on most civil claims expired in 1998, he agreed to a recorded interview. Ware's testimony, preserved in the Rio Grande County Historical Society's archive, runs to over 40 pages. The silence protocol predated galactic resources, Ware said. When we reopened the old tunnels, we found evidence that miners in the 1870s had observed the same rule. There were hand signal charts carved into the timber supports. There were notebooks in the debris, filled with written instructions. Whatever the reason for the silence, it went back over a century. Ware described his own experience with the protocol in careful, measured terms. I followed the rule for 4 years without understanding why. Then one night in 1988, I was doing a late inspection with a new worker, a kid from Texas named Harmon. We were at about 500 feet checking support timbers when Harmon forgot himself. He said something. I don't remember what, probably just a question about the inspection. Just a few words. Normal speaking volume. Ware paused in the recording before continuing. And something answered. Orozco asked what he meant. I mean exactly what I said. Something in the tunnel answered him. Not an echo. I know what echoes sound like. This was a voice. It came from deeper in the drift, from the direction we hadn't gone yet. And it said the same words Harmon had just said. Same voice, same inflection. Like a recording being played back, except it wasn't a recording. It was something in the dark, repeating what it had heard. Ware reported the incident to his supervisors the following day. He expected to be dismissed or reassigned. Instead, his supervisor, the same man Sundberg had mentioned, a manager named Thomas Brennan, nodded slowly and made a note in a ledger he kept locked in his desk. He said it had happened before, Ware recalled. He said it happened every few years, whenever someone forgot the protocol. He said the important thing was not to answer. Don't respond to the voice. Don't acknowledge it. Just leave, silently, and don't go back to that section for at least 48 hours. Ware asked what would happen if someone did respond. Brennan's answer, according to Ware, was 3 words: we don't know. The testimonies collected by Orozco suggest that the phenomenon was experienced by multiple workers over the years, though most were reluctant to discuss it, even decades later. A driller named Raymond So described hearing conversations coming from unoccupied tunnels, fragments of speech in voices he didn't recognize, always just below the threshold of comprehension. A maintenance worker named Ellen Vasquez reported that her tools would occasionally be moved to different locations during her shift, always when she was working alone, and always in sections where the silence protocol was in effect. We joked about it, Vasquez said, called it the listener. But nobody really thought it was funny. We just didn't know what else to do. You can't report something like that to HR. You can't file a complaint about a voice in the dark. Thomas Brennan, the supervisor who allegedly kept records of protocol violations and their consequences, died in 1994 of lung cancer. His personal effects were sold at a state auction, and any notebooks or ledgers he maintained were never recovered. The underground workings at Summitville were sealed in 1991, shortly before Galactic Resources declared bankruptcy. The sealing was ostensibly for safety reasons: unstable tunnels, contaminated water, the general hazards of abandoned mining infrastructure. But Ware suggested an additional motivation. Brennan was dying by then. He knew he wouldn't be around to enforce the protocol, and he was worried about what would happen if people went down there without understanding the rules. The last thing he did before he got too sick to work was make sure those tunnels were sealed properly. Not just closed, sealed. Concrete and steel. Like he was trying to keep something in as much as keep people out. The Summitville site remains heavily contaminated and is managed by the Environmental Protection Agency as a Superfund location. Access is restricted. The underground workings are inaccessible, buried beneath the debris of the open pit operation and the engineered barriers installed during cleanup. But the mountain above those sealed tunnels remains exactly as it has been for millennia. The silence there is unchanged, vast and deep, the kind of silence that seems to absorb sound rather than simply lacking it. A cleanup worker named Joseph Bitzilli, who spent 3 summers at Summitville between 2001 and 2004, mentioned one detail to Orozco during a follow-up interview in 2008. Sometimes, when the wind was right, you could hear something from the old tunnels, not from the sealed entrances. Those were solid, nothing getting through. From the ventilation shafts, the old ones from the 19th century that nobody had thought to close. Little openings in the rock scattered across the mountain. Most of them were too small to notice. But if you got close to one and you listened carefully, you could hear something. Orozco asked what he heard. Breathing, Bitzilli said. Slow, steady breathing, like something down there was asleep or waiting. I mentioned it to one of the EPA supervisors once. She told me it was just air pressure differentials, wind moving through underground spaces. She said it was normal. Bitzilli was quiet for a moment. But wind doesn't breathe in and out at the same pace. Wind doesn't pause like it's listening. Whatever's down there, it's not wind. And I don't think it's asleep anymore. I think it's been learning. All those years of silence, all those voices it heard before the protocol, I think it's been practicing. The ventilation shafts at Summitville were sealed by the EPA in 2011, part of a final remediation effort. The official justification was preventing unauthorized access and reducing contamination migration. The breathing, according to workers present at the sealing, continued until the last shaft was closed. And then it stopped, or moved somewhere else. The Summitville mine produced gold intermittently for over a century before becoming one of the worst environmental disasters in Colorado history. Its cyanide contamination poisoned a river and killed an ecosystem. But the miners who worked its deepest levels remember a different danger, one that no cleanup can remediate, no barrier can contain. The silence protocol kept it quiet for 100 years. The sealed tunnels may keep it quiet for 100 more. But somewhere beneath 11,000 feet of mountain, in the darkness where human voices once echoed and were answered, something learned to speak. And the men who heard it are still waiting to find out what it finally decides to say. The town was empty when he arrived. It was not empty when he left. Ashcroft sits in the Upper Castle Creek Valley, 11 miles south of Aspen, Colorado, at an elevation of 9,500 feet. The road that leads there today is paved but narrow, winding through aspen groves and past beaver ponds that reflect the surrounding peaks. In autumn, the trees turn gold and the tourists come to photograph them. In winter, the road closes entirely and Ashcroft returns to the silence that has defined it for over a century. The town was founded in 1880, part of the silver rush that transformed the Roaring Fork Valley. Within 2 years, Ashcroft had grown to rival Aspen itself. 2,500 residents, 20 saloons, a newspaper, and grand ambitions of becoming the regional hub. Investors laid out streets in a grid pattern, built a smelter, and petitioned for a railroad connection that they were certain would cement the town's prosperity. The railroad never came. The tracks went to Aspen instead. By 1885, Ashcroft was in decline. The easily accessible ore had been extracted, and without rail connections, shipping costs made further mining uneconomical. Residents began drifting away to Aspen, to Denver, to newer boomtowns where fortunes still waited to be made. The 20 saloons became 10, then 5, then 2. The newspaper ceased publication. The smelter fell silent. The conventional history of Ashcroft holds that this decline continued gradually until the town was abandoned entirely, a victim of economic forces that had created and then destroyed dozens of similar communities across the American West. By 1890, the story goes, Ashcroft was a ghost town, empty streets, boarded windows. Another cautionary tale about the impermanence of mining wealth. But the records tell a different story. The United States Census of 1890 was conducted between June and October of that year, with enumerators traveling to every community in the nation to count heads and record demographic information. The census was a massive undertaking, particularly in the sparsely populated territories of the West, where a single enumerator might cover hundreds of square miles of mountain terrain. The enumerator assigned to Pitkin County was a man named Harold Dunmore. Dunmore was a Denver schoolteacher who supplemented his income by taking census work during summer breaks. He had conducted enumerations in previous decades without incident, traveling to mining camps and ranching communities with his standard issue portfolio, recording names and occupations in the careful penmanship that the Census Bureau required. His 1890 assignment included Aspen and its surrounding communities, Independence, Ashcroft, and several smaller camps scattered through the valleys. Dunmore began his work in June, systematically moving from settlement to settlement, completing his enumeration sheets and forwarding them to the regional supervisor in Denver. His report on Ashcroft, dated September 15, 1889, was unusual in several respects. First, the date. Dunmore recorded his visit as occurring in September 1889, a full year before the census was officially conducted. Census Bureau records show that he should not have been in Pitkin County until the summer of 1890. His presence in Ashcroft in 1889 is unexplained. Second, the brevity. Standard enumeration forms require detailed household information, names, ages, occupations, birthplaces, and literacy status for every resident. Dunmore's Ashcroft submission contained none of this. His entire report consisted of 3 words written across the first page of an otherwise blank enumeration portfolio, town already empty. Third, the finality. Dunmore made no follow-up visits. He submitted no supplementary reports. He recorded no population figure, not even 0. The Census Bureau's published 1890 returns for Pitkin County list Ashcroft's population as blank, with a marginal note indicating no enumeration conducted. A regional supervisor named Clarence Worthington questioned Dunmore about the Ashcroft report in correspondence dated November 1890. Worthington's letter, preserved in the National Archives, asked Dunmore to clarify his findings and explain the anomalous date. Dunmore's reply was brief. I arrived in Ashcroft on the morning of September 15th and found the town completely abandoned. Every structure was empty. No residents could be located. I departed the same afternoon. I have nothing further to report. Worthington accepted this explanation and closed the file. Ashcroft was officially recorded as having 0 population in 1890, but photographs told a different story. A commercial photographer named William Henry Jackson traveled through the Roaring Fork Valley in late October 1889, approximately 6 weeks after Dunmore's visit. Jackson was documenting mining towns for the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad, producing images that would be used to promote tourism and investment in the region. His photographs of Ashcroft, now held in the Colorado Historical Society's collection, show a town that was anything but empty. Smoke rises from at least 7 chimneys in Jackson's Main Street photograph. Laundry hangs on lines behind 2 of the visible buildings. A horse stands hitched to a post outside what appears to be a general store. And in one image, a photograph of a boarding house on the town's eastern edge. A table is visible through a first-floor window set with plates and cups as if dinner had just been served. There are no people in any of the photographs. Jackson's field notes, also preserved in the Historical Society's collection, describe his Ashcroft visit in professional terms. He mentions excellent morning light and favorable weather for plate exposure. He records the locations and subjects of each photograph. He does not mention speaking to any residents, but he also does not mention finding the town abandoned. The absence is conspicuous. Photographers of Jackson's era typically noted interactions with local residents who often provided useful information about landmarks and posed for portraits. Jackson's Ashcroft notes contain no such references. No names, no conversations, no human presence whatsoever, and yet the photographs show evidence of active habitation, smoke, laundry, horses, meals in progress. A historian named Virginia Llewellyn examined this discrepancy in 1973 while preparing an exhibition on Colorado ghost towns. Llewellyn compared Dunmore's report with Jackson's photographs and concluded that one of them must be an error. Either Dunmore visited a different settlement and mistakenly labeled it Ashcroft, or Jackson's photographs were mislabeled and actually depict a different town, Llewellyn wrote. The 2 accounts cannot both be accurate. A town cannot be simultaneously empty and occupied. But subsequent research undermined both alternative explanations. Dunmore's travel logs, obtained from his family's estate in 1981, clearly document his route through Pitkin County, including specific geographic references that confirm he visited the correct location. And Jackson's photographs include identifiable landmarks, the distinctive profile of Castle Peak, the layout of the main street, the position of the smelter, that match historical maps of Ashcroft exactly. Dunmore found the town empty on September 15th. Jackson found evidence of habitation 6 weeks later. Neither man reported seeing a single resident. The last known residents of Ashcroft departed in the early 1890s, according to Pitkin County property records. The final property tax payment was recorded in 1893. By 1900, the town was officially listed as abandoned, its buildings already beginning to deteriorate. But visitors to Ashcroft in the intervening years reported experiences that never appeared in official records. A prospector named George Kimball passed through Ashcroft in August 1891, according to a diary entry discovered in a Denver antique store in 2004. Kimball wrote that he had intended to camp in one of the abandoned buildings, but changed his mind after finding the remains of a meal on a table, as if the occupants had stepped out moments before. The food was not rotten, Kimball wrote. It was not fresh either. It had a quality I cannot describe, as if it had been waiting for a very long time without changing. I did not stay. I do not believe I was welcome. A surveyor named Thomas Beckley filed a report with the Pitkin County Assessor's Office in October 1892 describing anomalous conditions in Ashcroft that prevented accurate property valuation. The report, 1 paragraph long, noted that several structures appeared occupied but could not be accessed for inspection, and recommended the assessment be deferred. The assessment was never completed. No follow-up survey was conducted. Ashcroft today is preserved as a historic site, maintained by the Aspen Historical Society. The remaining structures have been stabilized and restored. Interpretive signs explain the town's history, its brief prosperity, and its gradual decline. Tourists walk the main street, photograph the weathered buildings, and imagine the lives of the miners who once sought their fortunes there. The interpretive signs do not mention Harold Dunmore's report. They do not mention William Henry Jackson's photographs. They do not mention the smoke, the laundry, the meals set on tables, or the town that was somehow empty and occupied at the same time. A volunteer docent named Patricia Huang, who has guided tours at Ashcroft since 2009, mentioned to a visitor in 2018 that she sometimes found small items in the restored buildings that she couldn't account for. A cup moved from one shelf to another, a chair pushed back from a table, a curtain opened that she was certain had been closed. "I tell myself it's tourists," Huang said. "But the tourists don't go inside. The buildings are locked. I'm the only one with keys." She paused. "Sometimes I wonder if the town is still waiting for the census to be corrected, waiting for someone to count the people who are still here. But I don't know how to count something I can't see. And I'm not sure I want to know the number if I could." The 1890 census was never corrected. Ashcroft's population remains officially blank, not zero, but blank, as if the question itself could not be answered. Harold Dunmore died in 1912, never having returned to Ashcroft. His last diary entry, written 3 days before his death, contained a single line that his family never understood. "I have counted them in my dreams. There were 2,500. There are still 2,500. Ashcroft produced silver worth millions during its brief prosperity. Its decline was documented, its abandonment recorded, its ghost town status confirmed by every official source. But the census of 1890 left a blank where a number should have been, and the photographs taken 6 weeks after the town was declared empty, show smoke still rising, laundry still hanging, meals still waiting on tables. 2,500 people lived in Ashcroft at its peak. Harold Dunmore found none of them on September 15, 1889. He spent the rest of his life trying to understand where they had gone and whether they had ever truly left.